Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Agent Smith, yeah! Today is December the 11th, 2022, and we are at day 12 of the first ever Neuro Subathon, and I don't know how to mute my alerts because it's broken in OBS. Whenever you have a computer running for a long period of time, certain stuff just tends to go awry, and my computer has been running continuously through the whole subathon. Pat on the back or whatever the back of the computer is. Good job, computer, for not crashing so far. OBS, however, has crashed twice, and the stream cuts out every 48 hours. Nevertheless, we persist, and there is how many hours on the timer? We have 17 hours and 45 minutes on the timer. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump into chat with Agent Smith. Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
How are you doing?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
Oh, can't complain.
Do you want to complain?
No.
Chat, do you want to complain? I'm hanging in there. We are on day number 12 of the Neuro Subathon. My stream has been live 24 hours a day, every day for 12 days.
Is it working out for you so far?
Absolutely, yes.
Nice.
This has been one of the best business moves in my career.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
That good, huh?
Yeah, well, the idea is it incentivizes me to make a bunch of different types of content that people want to see that I would never normally get myself to do. But it's like kind of a cool idea. So, you know, whenever you have like an idea in the back of your mind and you're like, you know, it'd be cool if I did the Hot Ones challenge, but I'm not famous enough to be invited onto that YouTube show. And then you kind of just say, okay, whatever. And then you don't do it. But for this, I set it as a goal for 1,000 subscribers, and people wanted to see that. So they subscribe. And we got there, and the set of hot sauces is like $125, which for people such as ourselves who don't have huge savings accounts, that's a substantial expense. But for this, I can more than afford it with the success of the subathon, and then we had it, and it was hilarious and awesome. So we've been able to do some really cool stuff. I did a beer tasting stream. I did the hot ones. We've had multiple guests on the stream. Lots of silly content. I played StarCraft 1, which I think I told you about last time. Warcraft 3 is one of the most poorly made remakes of any game, and I got to test that out firsthand. I didn't believe it at first, but it is a disaster. And it's been really cool to also show my Dungeons & Dragons campaign during the night. That's what I put on while I'm sleeping. So I do have content that a lot of people who follow my channel haven't been able to see because our D&D sessions are irregular. They're not always on Thursday. It's like every second to fourth Thursday we'll have a session, but I've been able to basically go from the first episode and then now we're already into the second season of my D&D show just by playing those while I sleep.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been quite the ride. I've seen other streamers do these, and I had no idea how my community was going to respond to this or whatever, but it's been a big success. So thank you everyone in the community for cheering us on here at the Neuro-related enterprises. One of the things that I didn't expect was when I put baked beans on my subathon 3 times, there was someone who paid out $464 or something, because that's the average number of beans in a baked beans can. That was very lucrative. The only downside was a can of baked beans has 125% of your daily sodium intake. And I ate 3 of those, so I was pretty dried up for a couple days.
Yeah, you got to stay hydrated.
Yep, but I've been able to recover. Yep, still doing my burpees every day and stuff, so it's basically business as usual, except for it's nonstop action.
Sounds like it.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess it's paying off, so more power to you.
Yeah. Oh, also, I've been completely disconnected from the news, and I have no idea what happened this week. So if you're asking me if anything caught my eye, no.
Nothing, huh?
No.
That's okay. I spent most of it playing Total War Shogun 2.
Oh. That's an older one, isn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the stuff in my library is older and remains untouched just because I was so busy with grad school for a long time.
Hmm.
So I've got quite the backlog, but a couple weeks ago I finally got into Shogun 2, and it's pretty interesting.
Nice. What do you like about that game? I haven't played it.
Um, well, I don't know if you've played any of the other Total War games, but Shogun 2 kind of does things a little bit differently, kind of shakes things up. It's a little more gamey, but it's gamey in a fun way. It kind of works out.
Hmm.
Also, I think it's the most, I mean, in terms of the historical setting of the Total War games, I think Shogun 2, with the Fall of the Samurai expansion, anyway, which is what I've been playing, is the most modern one, is the most modern setting.
Hmm.
So that's pretty cool. You get to actually call in like naval bombardments and stuff
Huh.
and use art field artillery. It's pretty fun.
What's the time period it's set in?
Um, Boshin War, Meiji Restoration, like
Hmm.
18 mid 1860s. Yeah, I've heard rumors that they've been toying with the idea of doing more modern settings, but I don't think they've done it yet. Usually they do stuff like classical period of history or medieval
Hmm.
or, Warhammer.
Yeah.
That's that's I think their most successful title thus far.
Yeah, I played some of the Warhammer Total Wars, but I haven't played Shogun. I think I got Shogun 2 back when it was brand new, and it just totally chunked my computer.
Oh,
Like,
really?
my computer couldn't handle it, yeah.
Too advanced for the time. Huh?
Yeah.
That's how it goes sometimes. I think that's what one of the Mech Warrior games did to my computer back in high school,
Hmm. We were
many,
talking
many
about that
moons ago.
series recently and how that one, for a lot of people, was a really mind blowing, engaging video game when it was fresh because you got like the joystick and the mechs were realistic in the sense that you got punished for making them too heavy or having too many guns where they would overheat. So it felt like a real engine that you had to manage, not just some like super mech thing that had no downsides. Definitely had downside if you customized it a certain way. Chat saying
Well,
Crisis was the OG benchmark game. Yeah, absolutely. Partly because it was so inefficient, but also because the graphics were good.
I think
What
somebody's asking about Peru. Did you hear about that?
I did not, but they said Peru happened. What happened in Peru?
Their president was removed from power. It was quite the political drama that played out over the past week.
Why? Why was he removed?
Oh, Congress has been after him from the start, from day one of his presidency. They've had it in for him for a while. Yeah, Peru's politics have been very contentious and unstable ever since the Odebrecht thing happened, a couple years ago. And so there's just been a succession of corruption scandals, impeachments, all manner of political intrigue. I think the most recent presidential election was like last year, I want to say, or maybe 2 years ago. I don't remember exactly, but in the runoff election, the only two candidates left standing were a far right candidate. Well, maybe not far right, but she's broadly accused of being far right anyway. Her name is Keiko Fujimori. She's the daughter of a former dictator of Peru. And then the other option was the guy that ended up winning, which was a guy named Castillo. And he was broadly associated with the far left, although he was no longer a member of the far left party that he had been a member of earlier in his career by the time he'd run for president. He wasn't really expected to win. He was basically just a school teacher with relatively little in the way of political experience, although he did have some. But he was definitely an outsider candidate. And so it was kind of surprising when he won, but it seemed to represent the desire of the Peruvian public to try something new after all of the previous corruption scandals that had downed multiple previous presidencies. Mind you, they've had like, what is it, half a dozen presidents now in the past five some years?
Holy crap. That's more than one
Yeah.
president a year.
Yeah, yeah. They've been coming and going pretty quickly.
revolving door.
Yeah. So the thing about Castillo is that, lacking experience, there was always the danger that he would just basically fail to navigate the halls of power. No matter how idealistic you are or well-meaning you are, if you don't know how to play the game of politics and negotiate with people and engage in the normal give and take with people in the political system, you're not going to make it very far. And that ended up being his downfall, it seems. I really never got the impression he fully knew what he was doing. From the outset, his administration was hobbled by a lot of problems with members of his cabinet. Lots of people would join and then they would get accused of corruption, or they would say something stupid, or they would disagree with him openly, and then they would either be fired or would be forced to resign, or would resign of their own accord. And the result is that there was a constant churn in and out of his cabinet, such that he was never really able to kind of settle down and start implementing his own policy, to really govern the way he wanted. So, maybe some of that is just strong personalities in his camp, but, more likely it was just down to him lacking political connections and not knowing how to navigate those kinds of egos that you encounter amongst the sort of people that you appoint to high-level cabinet positions. So inexperience, in other words. But the bigger problem was Congress. Even though he won the presidency, well, he didn't have a political party, but allied political parties, shall we say, in Congress were not a majority. So, the far left political parties, or even just the left wing political parties, did not have a strong enough majority in Congress to really pass his agenda. Quite the contrary, a lot of people in Congress were very, very skeptical of him. There had been a lot of accusations that he was, basically a secret communist during the presidential election. And so that skepticism carried through, and Congress basically just picked him apart. They went out of their way to try to find anything and everything that could be perceived as any kind of corruption or wrongdoing. And he just was not able to navigate it. And eventually, this past week, Congress was set to vote to impeach him. And so rather than, allow them basically to do that, he tried to dissolve Congress. And I think that's technically legal in Peru's politics, because I remember that had happened before a couple of years ago. There had been a previous president who had done that, and it forced new elections. But maybe the context was different this time or something, because it seems that the Constitutional Court came out and said pretty quickly, this is not legal. So Congress, for their part, basically just ignored him and voted to just remove him from power outright. And at that point, he just lost all support. Like, everybody abandoned him. Like, high-level cabinet members just walked away, resigned, announced that they weren't going to support him. Congress just went full out and completely chucked him out of power. Supposedly even his own bodyguards refused to protect him in the end. Supposedly he was set to try to travel to Mexico as an asylum seeker, but he didn't even make it that far before he got arrested, and he's currently being held in custody on charges of rebellion, which I imagine is as serious as it sounds. So his presidency ultimately just collapsed. And currently his running mate is the current sitting president. Yeah, I don't have her name in front of me here. I think it starts with a B or something. Oh, here it is. Dina Boluarte. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. But she's going to try to run a quote-unquote unity government, which is almost certainly not going to happen. But she's going to try, so more power to her. But yeah, that's the past week was the fall of the Castillo government, and it was quite the show, quite the drama.
Did he just refuse to work with anyone? Like, he didn't work with his cabinet. He didn't compromise on anything. What did he want to do?
I mean, he was a reformer at heart, or at least that's how he painted himself. But I mean, it's one of those things where you can't really know for sure. I mean, when a presidential administration is sufficiently dysfunctional, it doesn't even really matter what you want to do. Because if you can't even get the basics down of, appointing people to your team and then working together as a team coherently, you're not going to be able to do anything. And it doesn't seem like Castillo was ever able to really make that happen. So yeah, he ran as an inexperienced outsider candidate. He governed as an inexperienced outsider candidate, and he was ejected from power as an inexperienced outsider candidate. So, costs and benefits, strengths and weaknesses. One of the trade-offs of getting an inexperienced outsider candidate is that they don't really know fully what they're doing all of the time. Ideally, they would have a team of experienced people to advise him. But it seems that either he did not have such people working for him or he didn't listen to them. Or maybe they just were incompetent. Who's to say?
Well, that's kind of what it sounded like Trump did a lot of the time, was he was just firing people at a rapid pace anytime someone would tell him he did something wrong. But this guy's
Yeah.
on the left instead of right-leaning like Trump is.
Yeah, but I don't know if it's a fair comparison because I don't know how populist he necessarily was. Again, without having been able to get his team in place and really compete on even terms with his political rivals, we can't really be for sure how truly authoritarian he was or just what his agenda really was. As was his agenda was dysfunction more than anything, and it just didn't work. So it kind of sucks if you're Peruvian and you wanted an outsider guy to come in and kind of shake things up and challenge the established political class. Your chosen champion to do that ended up kind of being a flop. So either people will kind of vote for another guy like that, try their luck again, or maybe they'll go for a more established candidate who maybe has a little more popular support.
Well, hope they have better luck with the next one. So the lesson for this time is they want to find someone who can talk to the other side and also have a team of people who they can trust. That seems so necessary for being an executive, is to have a functional cabinet, because as an executive, you're someone who should have pretty high charisma and influence stat, but you can't be expected to know how to do everything. It's kind of like being a CEO of a company. Like, you're in a high up position, but if like the software breaks, that's someone else's job to fix, and you oftentimes have no idea how to do that. But that's okay as long as you have someone who you know and trust who knows how to fix it. But it seems like this is the kind of guy who is just going to try to do everything and doesn't trust anyone's expertise, and it's just kind of a stick in the mud.
That could be the case. I think part of the problem too may be that he just did not adequately prepare for power. Again, as a guy who basically had minimal experience in politics and who had principally just been a school teacher before he got into politics, it may be that he just wasn't really aware that, if you do think that you are going to win the presidency, then you need to have a team more or less in place before you get started. You can't start forming the team when you become president. You need to be able to hit the ground running, so to speak, and have that team ready to go. It might take some time to appoint them, but you should at least already know who you're going to appoint. So it may be that, as a kind of fringe outsider candidate, he didn't really fully expect to actually win. And so in that sense, maybe he didn't prepare for that reason, but it could be, again, maybe he just didn't know to do that. So as a result, he ended up kind of dragging his feet a little bit, and his administration wasn't able to, well, ever hit its stride. Yeah, if you look at U.S. presidents, if you look at I shouldn't say American. If you look at presidential candidates in the United States, let's put it like that, almost all of them have the sets of advisors and whatnot that they're going to have during their prospective presidency, already advising them when they're on campaign. So they build up sort of their cohort, their little cabinet, if you will, mini cabinet, while they're still running. And so when they do win the presidency, oftentimes it's just a matter of slotting those people into positions within government. Or maybe, maybe not even that, maybe even just giving them like a de facto title, like official advisor or something. That's what Donald Trump did with a lot of people. He didn't appoint them to official agencies. He would just give them special statuses, as some kind of high-level advisor that had his own personal backing and authority, such that they could kind of move in and out of the halls of power, in Washington, despite the fact that they didn't have the normal sorts of credentials and powers that people with actual office normally have.
He handed out hall passes.
Bas- Basically,
Look,
yeah.
I'm not giving you any substantive power, but you can walk around in this building. Here's a hall pass. Oh, thank you.
So yeah, he's I don't think Castillo kind of knew about that side of politics. There's a lot more to politics than just the popularity contest aspect. The actual machinery and organization of running a campaign and then an administration and then negotiating with people both inside your administration and outside. All of that is more technical stuff that actually does require a lot of skill and experience in order to produce desirable results. So good luck to Peru.
Yeah, hopefully they can find someone who they like and who can actually lead them. It sounds like if they're waffling between far left and far right candidates, they're pretty polarized right now.
Well, Peru is polarized on a couple different dimensions. There's obviously kind of the left-right divide, like you would expect. Um, but there's also a kind of pretty significant urban-rural divide too. The city of Lima in Peru comprises a huge disproportionate chunk of the country's entire population. It's an example of a city in a developing country that ends up monopolizing a lot of the capital, political power, economic activity. I think they used to call those primate cities. So think of like Mexico. Like in Mexico, almost all of the large cities are maybe like 1 million people, 2 million people, and then there's Mexico City, which is one of the largest cities on the planet. So that's an example of what Peru kind of has. They've kind of got an even distribution roughly in terms of urban population, and then there's this huge outlier in Lima. But then there's also sort of the kind of racial almost. It's sort of like Native Americans versus mestizo, because Peru has in the Andes highlands some of the last surviving like pure-blooded Native American groups in the hemisphere. Lots of Native American groups were died out or ended up getting watered down. Were forced to relocate, but there's two major ethnic groups, native ethnic groups in the Andes highlands that are actually still pretty large and have actually managed to maintain a lot of their culture over time. But they're also kind of poorer and a little isolated. There's kind of a barrier between them and the people who live on the coast of Peru, which is more economically developed, more linked to the international economy, more built up, and is more ethnically distinct. It has more of a mestizo population, people of mixed heritage, specifically mixed Spanish and native heritage for the most part, but also others. I think in the northern coastal area, there's actually a lot of people of Japanese descent, because there was a period in the late 19th century when plantation owners, not only in Peru but in other parts of the world, were kind of going out of their way to try to find labor. And by that point, they couldn't use slave labor anymore. So what they did instead is they used basically what were migrant workers, what we would call today migrant workers. And they took them from different places. India was common, Indonesia. But there was a period of a couple decades in the late 19th century when there was a lot of Japanese migrant workers that went abroad to work on these places. And it's actually because of that outflow that there's a lot of people of Japanese descent in Hawaii, because Hawaii also had a plantation economy at that time, and they took a lot of migrant workers to work on the plantations from Japan. But in Peru, they did the same thing. And so as a result of that particular period in time, there's a relatively high number of Japanese Peruvians in sort of that northwestern part of the country. But anyway, that's another dimension of political divide there. And of course, there's class as well. There's a lot of Latin American countries have political economies that sort of inculcate and reproduce a lot of inequality. And Peru is not really any different. So, there's a wealthy elite that has disproportionate power, and then there's sort of a much weaker, disorganized working class. So yeah, there's a lot of points of division there.
By weaker working class, you mean weak in influence in politics?
Yeah, yeah. The political elites in Peru have done pretty well in sort of keeping them at arm's length from the political system. That's not to say they haven't had their successes. I think the political left in Peru actually won power briefly in the 1980s. but I don't think it lasted very long, and they ended up getting blamed for a lot of the economic dysfunction of that period. The 1980s in Peru saw a decent amount of hyperinflation, as I recall. Yeah, I think they were called APRA, if I'm not mistaken. That was the left political party that was able to win power at the time. And as I recall, they had been elected to try to deal with the country's economic problems. And then they just got worse, and so they ended up kind of getting booted out. So, but, occasionally they are able to kind of get their foot in the door, so to speak, able to kind of get some power. And even if they haven't been able to lead the country per se, they still remain one of the dominant political factions. Yeah, elites in Peru have been much more successful than elites in Bolivia. Bolivia's elites basically lost to the country in the early 20th century. That was partly because the economy kind of collapsed. And it actually kind of collapsed before the Great Depression. A lot of Latin American economies are very dependent on exports of commodities, and so a lot of them really struggled because of the Depression in the 1930s, because commodity prices, as you would guess, just collapsed. And so a lot of commodity dependent economies kind of went with it. But Bolivia had problems even before then, because one of their principal exports had been, I think, silver and tin. And basically their reserves just kind of ran out in the teens or 1920s, something around there. And the result is that the country's economy just borderline imploded. And a lot of the traditional political elites didn't have sufficient power to kind of retain control. And so Bolivia went through a period in the 1930s and 40s, maybe into the 50s too, where there was this sort of weird alliance of left-wing and right-wing nationalists that were able to maintain intermittently control over the country. It's kind of an interesting period for them. They actually had
if you're left or right, as long as you're a nationalist. Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, for like the working class people of Bolivia, there was a very clear divide between like themselves and the political elites. And so, whether you were like a Native American worker, a miner working in one of the mines, or if you were more of a European descended farmer in the coastal lowland in the eastern part of Bolivia, neither group really held the elites in high regard at that time. And there was other problems too, like they lost a war against Paraguay. That was the Gran Chaco War, I think it was called. It's like basically the northwestern half of Paraguay, as it is now, all of that was disputed territory at one point with Bolivia. And in the 1930s, I think, they finally just up and fought a war over it. I think there had been oil reserves that had supposedly been discovered there. So that kind of renewed interest in the territory, obviously. And that led to the border war, and Bolivia actually lost, despite being, a larger country. And that really did probably more than anything to discredit the government, the status quo powers that be. And so the nationalists were really able to ride that into power after the fact. Yeah, things kind of stabilized in the 1950s. After that, basically, they kind of de facto aligned more with the United States, and they were able to get a lot of foreign aid, which kind of helped the economy a bit. But it's never really fully recovered either, from that 1920s mineral bust. They've kind of been struggling to find their way since then. And then there was the far right coup in the 1940s and World War II. That was an interesting episode. That scared Washington because Washington already suspected that the Argentine government was pro-Axis and that it might actually join the war on the side of the Axis. And so then when there was a far-right coup in Bolivia, there was broad suspicion in Washington that the Argentines were behind it, that they were secretly trying to kind of set up some kind of puppet fascist government in Bolivia. It was probably not the case. Washington was probably being paranoid. But certainly the new nationalist government that was set up was even more skeptical than the previous government had been of the United States and of the Allies, in World War II. And basically the only reason that they didn't cause more trouble is because the United States effectively bought them off. one of the major efforts of the United States in World War II, one of many, is that the United States really went out of their way to try to organize all of the countries in Latin America to try to get them either actively supporting the Allies in the war or at least remaining neutral and not providing material support to the Axis. And that was a pretty heavy lift, diplomatically speaking, because a lot of countries in Latin America were pretty skeptical of the United States and were mostly just looking to try to make money, whether it meant selling resources to the Axis or the Allies. So the United States, in a lot of cases, actually cut a deal with local governments in which they agreed to just buy all of their produce of certain strategic materials, like basically as much as they could produce, the United States promised to buy. And in exchange, the United States would agree to buy at fixed prices and would also give basically credits, effectively subsidized loans that those governments could use to buy, basically whatever they wanted in order to try to modernize their economies. I think the first major steel mill in Brazil was actually built in as part of this program. They used the money they got from the US in this period to kind of build a steel mill that ended up producing a good chunk of the country's steel after the war. And that was a big part of the government's industrialization push. Other governments basically just stole the money, just corruption or squandered it. Industrialization and modernization is a difficult process, especially if you're a poorer country in which you didn't have the fortune of having it happen organically, so to speak. So, achieving modernization via public policy requires a lot of professionalism, expertise, a lot of organization, and those are the kinds of human assets, the kinds of human capital that a lot of developing countries just don't really have, or at least they severely lack in them anyway. So as a result, a lot of countries in Latin America, despite having access to an opportunity to industrialize, frequently failed to capitalize on it because they just didn't have the sufficient planning, basically, to really make the most use of the money.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of trust involved in that process where you, for one, put trust in the process that industrialization is good and can happen in your country where you are. And then you have to make sure the money is handed off to the correct people. And then you have to make sure that those people use that for its intended purpose to scale up new industries and projects and things like that that didn't exist before, which doing new stuff is hard. So that's like an awkward stage of development for sure. Once things are ironed out, then scaling things up is relatively easier.
Yeah, once you kind of have a comparative advantage in some specific niche of the modern economy, then your economy can kind of take care of itself, but getting there is hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's not even just about organization, like you have to pick the right industries. If you look at industrial policies of a country like South Korea, for example, it wasn't just things like the automotive industry or semiconductors or shipbuilding that they tried to develop industries in. They tried to develop industries in a broad range of sectors, but it's just almost all of them failed, save for those few that actually succeeded to the point where they got a comparative advantage and were able to develop those into world-beating firms. So industrial policy is very expensive, it's inefficient, but there's also the argument to be made that it's one of the only ways to really reach that next level of economic development.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the most successful examples of modernization was Japan. I think everybody is familiar with that story. And their process of modernization in the late 19th century, transitioning from feudal Japan to something resembling modernity, effectively to imperial Japan. That process involved a lot of state intervention. Effectively, a lot of the initial modern industries they developed, like the rail industry, mining, et cetera, a lot of those industries were state-owned initially. And later on, when they got to of sufficient scale, and effectively became too expensive for the government to continue to subsidize, they just privatized them. And that created some problems economically. Like there was a lot of downsizing that was necessary in order to make them profitable. But the business families, effectively, that they were sold to were sufficiently proficient to be able to make that work, and they were able to turn those industries into competitive free market privately owned firms. And from there, things just kind of took care of themselves, although it still took several decades for Japan to really fully catch up to the West. I think they did. I don't think Japan really caught up to the West until like maybe the 1960s or so. So they were definitely modernizing quickly, and they were able to field like a military, obviously, that was able to compete and threaten Western empires in the two world wars. But that doesn't mean that their economy was really comparable, of a comparable level of development. Uh, you know, the only reason really they were able to have a modern military is because they just put a lot of government resources into the arms industry in Japan. Effectively, those industries were state owned and received an immense amount of subsidies. If you actually look at the kind of stuff Japan was exporting at that time in like the early 20th century, a lot of it was actually just silk and silk products. So that doesn't sound like much, but they were able to turn that around into foreign capital, foreign currency that they were then able to use to buy foreign manufacturing equipment, in some cases, even just foreign weapons and foreign ships, warships specifically, directly from the West. And they were able to use those industries and weapons to build what resembled, anyway, a modern war machine, despite the fact that the rest of their economy was largely just dependent on the one competitive international industry they really had, which again was silk-based textiles.
Why did they want to make a really big army?
That's an interesting question. I would argue two reasons, and this is just off the top of my head. Somebody more familiar with the subject would probably be able to go more in depth. But off the top of my head, the immediate incentive in the late 19th century was just to be able to defend the country. It's not a period that people remember really well, this sort of period of opening up, 1860s, 70s. But that was actually a period when Japan was subject to unequal treaties, quote unquote, of the same kind that China was subjected to. So these frequently involved foreign companies and foreign governments, specifically Western governments, forcing Japan to give favorable access to their markets. And they were able to, use those unequal treaties to kind of push them around, manipulate Japanese politics. Foreigners played a role in the Meiji Restoration because the different factions that were fighting each other for power, actually had foreign backing of one kind or another. I don't think it was like really political per se. I don't think like one government or other was really backing firmly one or the other faction. I think it was more commercial than that, basically. American or French or British firms were basically catering to one side or the other as a favored client. But regardless, I'd have to read more about it to kind of comment more than that. But regardless, it was a period in which Japan was very vulnerable. It wasn't like the powerhouse that it would become later. So as a result, there was a big prioritization of developing a modern military just so that Japan could kind of stave off these unequal treaties. And they were able to do that actually pretty quickly. I think they were able to force the Western nations to scrap the unequal treaties as early as I want to say 1880s or so, maybe the 1890s, which was, pretty quick since they'd only really been forced to open up starting in the 1850s. So it only took them a couple decades to reach a point where the West was sufficiently intimidated by the power of the Japanese Navy that they felt they couldn't really boss them around anymore. But again, that required a lot of focus and emphasis on the development of the military over and above other sectors. And that was something they carried forward into the early 20th century. So the other incentive for focusing on the military after they reached a point where they could kind of stave off Western pressure was expansion, because one of the ideas that really gained currency in Japanese politics was imperialism, and maybe later on after World War I, militarism, specifically German-style militarism, which became very popular in a number of countries around the world, not just Japan. But there was a sense that Japan needed to expand, and there were various arguments kind of given for why it was necessary. One, there was a sense that they would never really be treated as equals by the Western empires, and so they needed to become larger and more powerful in order to really be able to be treated equally. And then there was the idea that they needed resources. Japan famously does not have a lot of natural resources, so there was a sense that in order for Japan to be truly independent of foreign influence and pressure, they needed to acquire more land with more of the resources they needed for their industry. And then there's also just a sense that Japan was a powerful nation and that it was sort of the prerogative of powerful nations to expand and build powerful empires. They were basically just modeling themselves on Western nations in that sense. So, it was a combination of economic incentives and pride to a degree, you could say. So
Mm.
that fed into an expansionist mindset. And that sort of mindset also lent itself to the emphasis, disproportionate emphasis on funding and building Japan's military and military industrial base in the early 20th century.
That makes sense. I didn't know about the unequal treaties thing, but it makes sense. It's kind of like you're dealing with gangsters or whatever, and they're like, sell us your wares for this price, and they have guns on their hip, and you're like, you can't really say no. They can just kill you or hurt you. So for them to have a military means that they can't be strong armed in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the catalysts for the Meiji Restoration in the first place. There was a sense that after the government had given in to Western demands to open up their market in the 1850s, after Commodore Perry came with the black ships, quote unquote, and kind of intimidated them into doing so, there was a big debate about, how to respond. Like, should we just open up the country and let modernization happen without thinking about it too much, or should we have more of a planned response to this, in which we really try to learn as much as we can while also trying to preserve our culture as best we can? It's kind of an interesting debate. You might think that the people who were for opening the economy would also be the ones who were most for changing it, and that there would be an opposing party that wanted to just close the economy and try to preserve tradition. But actually, it was kind of more nuanced than that. Actually, pretty much both sides wanted to maintain openness and learn from the West. The real point of debate seemed to be more about tradition and how best to preserve it. It actually came down to a battle pretty much between the shogun and the emperor. If you're, I don't know how familiar people are with Japan's political system historically, but basically what happened is that, centuries and centuries ago, the emperor's power was usurped by a guy who called himself basically the shogun. And it's the kind of pattern that you can see in a lot of countries' histories. Effectively, there's an empire and an emperor, and he rules over a bunch of stuff, a lot of territories, cities, what have you. And in order to run it, he creates a big bureaucracy, a big state apparatus to try to govern all of it. But what happens over time is that the emperor's descendants become less and less interested over time in governance. Instead, they just increasingly depend on professional bureaucrats to just deal with the governance themselves without much oversight. And of course, you can pretty much guess what happens. Eventually, the bureaucrats get ambitious. If they control all the levers of power, well, then why not just use those levers of power to eject the emperor and become the new power?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what happened in Japan. One of the leading nobles at the time just declared himself shogun, protector, basically, of the empire. They kept the emperor around, but he was powerless. It was basically a symbolic figurehead, and the real power lay with the shogun, since he was the one that actually controlled the apparatus of state. So that lasted for, a couple centuries, basically. But then in the Meiji Restoration, it was the shogunate that had opened the country up and was kind of trying to balance modernization and the new pressures from foreign ideas and goods and whatnot with the desire of traditionalists in Japan to resist that trend. And the shogun was basically unable to do that. And the result is that opportunists started talking with the emperor and managed to talk him into supporting what in effect was a rebellion, which restored, hence the name Meiji Restoration, the emperor to a position of power. He effectively once again became the actual leader of Japan. And the shogunate was effectively disbanded, along with a lot of the samurai, and whatnot that had been kind of part of it. Samurai warrior caste still lasted a bit afterwards, but it was not for that long. They ended up having to shift roles, basically. One of the weirder things I read about this period of Japan's history is that the south of Japan was the more exposed portion of Japan to Western trade, and by extension, Western ideas. But they were actually more in the traditional camp. They wanted to maintain trade and whatnot. That actually benefited the feudal lords in the south. So, they didn't really want to end trade per se. But they were actually the ones that were the most concerned with the erosion of Japanese culture. And it was actually them, specifically this one clan. I think his name was Satsuma Saiga. I'm probably mispronouncing it. He was one of the major clans in Kyushu, the big southern island. And it was actually him and this one other big clan, I think the Chonshu or something, that kind of banded together and supported the emperor in the Boshin War, successfully so. But then there was a twist ending to that. The emperor ended up implementing a lot of reforms. He was trying to modernize the country as quickly as possible, but he actually did so quickly and ended up, in doing so, discarding so many traditional privileges, whatnot, of these traditional elite, and getting rid of other aspects of traditional Japan, that the same people that had backed him in the Boshin War ended up turning on him, specifically those two big clans in the south. And that led to the Satsuma Rebellion in the 1870s, which probably was never going to succeed. But it was just interesting that that same guy, Satsuma Saiga, was the one who had supported him before, ended up fighting against him later on, specifically because he thought he was not doing enough to protect traditional Japanese customs. So of course the rebellion failed, and the Japanese government just sort of crushed him in somewhat dramatic fashion. I don't know how many people remember the Tom Cruise movie, The Last Samurai.
Yep.
So that was basically a kind of Hollywood version of the Satsuma Rebellion, sort of your traditional samurai warriors versus the modernized Imperial Japanese army. So that actually did happen. And Satsuma Saiga and his sort of core followers ended up getting cornered. And famously, the last battle of the war was him and his samurai charging, against an army, a modern army of artillery, muskets, and also warships, which provided artillery support.
End of an era, very kind of picturesque and graphic battle.
Very much so.
What a gross movie, says the chat. Definitely very pro-American bent in some ways.
It was actually not uncommon to have Western advisors at the time. One of the ways to modernize, among the countries that tried to anyway in the late 19th century, one of the ways to do it was to just import Western experts and then just have them teach your people. So in the terms of modernizing a military, they imported a lot of veterans from the West, or even just working officers, and they would just have them drill their people, teach their own officers, etc., in order to try to get them up to speed, so to speak. There was also judges and lawyers and stuff like that, but that's not as sexy as soldiers and veterans, so they don't get as much attention. Yeah, if you want an example of judges and lawyers that are maybe a little more prominent, you can look at an example like Thailand. Thailand went out of its way to kind of try to modernize in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and they actually managed to build a judicial system that was pretty comparable to Western judicial systems. And for a long time, they actually had Westerners as judges in their system, while they were still teaching their own citizens, their own lawyers and judges and whatnot. In the interim, they would just have Westerners come in and do it. So it wasn't unheard of. I don't know that the movie The Last Samurai really portrayed it accurately. That is to say, portrayed the role of Westerners accurately. But the idea of Westerners being there, that at least was accurate. That definitely did happen.
Mm-hmm.
How did I get onto that?
We're talking about industrialization and modernization, and Japan is one of the countries that successfully industrialized and modernized pretty well.
Right.
That was a good overview, though. We do tangents great here at World Discussion with Agent Smith. We started with Peru, and we got to Japan, and we went through a bit of Japan.
Well, I've had Japan on my mind, because of the Shogun 2 game, because the Fall of the Samurai expansion takes place. And one of the fun things about the game is that they have a nice in-game encyclopedia, and they actually provide historical context for different units and buildings and stuff, as opposed to just like showing you their actual game function, the game mechanic behind them. They'll actually give you a little history blurb talking about them. So I've actually been learning a bit about the Meiji restoration through the game and by peripheral research I've done on like Wikipedia and stuff. So that's the fun thing about strategy games with a historical background. It really is a good learning opportunity in addition to just being fun.
That's cool. I always thought the a lot of Japanese culture and history is pretty distinct and interesting. They're an island nation that's close to China, so there's a lot of overlap there. But they were behind in some ways, but because they were smaller, they were more flexible with the like process
Yeah.
of industrialization,
Oh
modernization.
yeah,
There are advantages to being a smaller country.
very much so. China had specific provinces that made the effort. Um, Maybe provinces isn't the right phrasing. It was more like local warlords, effectively. In the wake of the Taiping Rebellion, there was a couple powerful uh, people who ran local armies that had largely been responsible for defeating the rebels. And it was actually those guys who went on to be basically designated generals responsible for the security in the lower Yangtze region.
Mm.
They tried to modernize, but it was not a national effort. So after a couple decades, China did have some modern industries, especially their arms industry and maybe textiles. But other than that, the government had really kind of dragged its feet about modernization. There were too many special interests, you might say, that were very opposed to it, not least of which was the class of mandarins that sort of manned the bureaucracy of China. They didn't like the idea of modern education because they thought it would discount the value of their own education, which was, of course, not Western.
Mm.
And of course, the palace eunuchs didn't really want any change because they were able to take advantage of the system as it was for their own personal benefit.
Mm.
So, yeah, just China was too big, too complex, and to a degree, too successful. It was already a pretty wealthy country, but, wealth can create a certain amount of complacency, so to speak.
Yeah,
Japan, sorry?
if they're stable and they have really long-standing traditions and they have dominance in their region, like why would they change fast? It
Yeah,
doesn't really make
exactly.
sense in the short term for the people who
Yeah,
benefit. Like you were saying, the people who currently have power, they don't really want big change to happen because that means someone else might get power.
exactly. So Japan didn't have that problem. They'd always been relatively poor. They did export like some silver, some textiles and stuff, but they were never a major exporter like China had been.
What did
So they had
China
pretty,
export?
oh God, just they were the economic engine of the planet for a long, long time. They, I think the main exports were silk and silk clothing and whatnot. They didn't monopolize the production of silk, but they produced the majority of it. It took people a long time to figure out how they were doing it. They were probably a little grossed out when they did figure it out. Silkworms is not the intuitive answer to the question, how is silk made? But that is actually how it's made.
We make the bugs do it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a weird but fascinating process. Yeah, at one point, there were some Western merchants that actually went to China and went out of their way to try to secretly collect the silkworms and smuggle them back to what was then Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, which is how the Byzantines were able to develop their own market and their own production of silk products. A little bit of early corporate espionage, you might say. But even then, the Chinese easily outproduced everybody else, even when other countries started learning how to do the process. But yeah, silk was very valuable. Porcelain was very valuable. Chinese porcelain was dominant variety of pottery on international markets for a very long time. Pretty much was up until the British figured out how to mass produce it. In the 1800s, they figured out a factory process by which they could just crank out huge amounts of pottery that looked exactly the same as traditional Chinese pottery, but it was a fraction of the cost. Probably not the same quality either, but consumers didn't mind, and that pretty much crushed that market for the Chinese afterwards.
Hmm.
But let's see, silk, porcelain. There was another one too. What was it? They were all pretty much in the lower Yangtze too. Yeah, porcelain was Jingdezhen. Silk was the Gan River basin. Oh, that's gonna bug the hell out of me. What was the other one? Somebody in chat. Tea. That's what it was.
Hmm.
Yeah, pretty much every province, maybe even like counties in China, has their own variety of tea. But there was one particular breed or type that was grown for export that ended up being sort of associated with China. and dominated international markets. And it was made in the lower Yangtze and exported from there. So tea was easily one of their major exports up until the British in the late 1800s figured out that they could grow it in the highlands of northeastern India, which is why Darjeeling, India is associated with tea and hippies and that kind of stuff. Yeah, that was originally a project by the British and specifically the East India Company. Well, actually, no, not by the. I think they were gone by that point. But Darjeeling, India, is basically an industrial policy on the part of the British, the result of an industrial policy on the part of the British, to try to break the Chinese monopoly on international exports of tea. And they were actually successful in doing that. But yeah, silk, tea, and porcelain, those were the big export items from China for like millennia, for a very long time. They probably had some other stuff too that's slipping my mind, but those were like the big ones that I'm remembering. I guess since we're talking about it, Japan was kind of a consolation prize. You know, the fact that Japan was poorer than China is relevant because if you're a foreign imperialist or a foreign trading company, you really want to trade with China. Like that's where the big markets are. You can make a lot of money selling there, and they produce a lot of stuff you can't get anywhere else. So you want to buy from them as well. So that China and the Chinese market was really the focus of a lot of imperial activity or slash commercial activity over the course of the early modern period up into the 19th century. Japan, in contrast, did not get nearly as much attention. Like the market was way too small and they didn't really export much that people needed that much. So they didn't get that much attention. And so, you know, on the downside, that meant that they weren't really benefiting as much from international trade. But of course, the upshot is that they didn't get as much foreign interference for a long time either. You know, there wasn't really a Japanese corollary to the Opium Wars, for example. So you might then ask, why did the United States, you know, via Commodore Perry, bother in the first place to forcibly open up Japan to foreign trade? You know, what was the point if the Japanese market was so small and poor? So the reason was that America had been basically cut out of the Chinese market. You know, we still had access, and American traders did do a pretty brisk business there, including drugs, as it happens. But we did not have like privileged access per se. You know, the British, the French, the other European empires, they very much were the leaders there as far as opening China's market and obtaining access to markets in China. And in so much as the United States was able to maintain access to that market, it was more or less at the sort of discretion of the British. You know, Britain and the United States were very close, significant trade partners even after the Revolutionary War, and remained so basically right up to the present day. And the result is that the British were pretty well inclined to allow American traders to have access to their part of the Chinese market, even though the United States was a different country. But that also meant that the United States did not really have leverage in that relationship. So the United States government wanted to try to go out and find a market for itself. And so, you know, options were limited, right? China, being the main one, had already had basically all of the attention. So that pretty much just left what was left, you know, which was only basically Japan and Korea. And so for that reason, the United States government dispatched a fleet, a small fleet, maybe more of a task force, to Japan and also Korea to try to force open those kingdoms. Successfully so, as it happens. You don't really hear about Korea as much. We actually did the same thing to Korea that we did to Japan in terms of opening up the market. But that didn't really have the same dramatic impact as it did in Japan. You know, there's no great modernization success story with Korea in the 19th century like there was with Japan, to the point where Japan actually was able to conquer Korea and subjugate it starting in the 1890s because they had made so much headway, whereas Korea had basically just stagnated. So that's what I mean when I say Japan was a consolation prize. Nobody else had bothered to try to force open the market. And the United States was kind of a bit player, so to speak, in the imperial game in the 19th century. So, small fry meets small fry. Yeah, we went out and tried to pick the fruit that we could reach, so to speak.
Mhm.
Random trivia with John Smith.
I like it.
Let's see. Since you didn't really have anything in mind, and I don't think we have any questions, right?
Not aside from mentioning Peru, from what I saw.
Yeah. Well, I guess, did you hear about the big rail strike that's kind of been in the offing in the US?
No.
Well, that is basically the main unions representing rail workers in the United States have been pushing really hard to get a new agreement with the rail companies in the United States. Obviously they want, higher pay and stuff, but they're also particularly interested in sick leave. During the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in 2020, a lot of workers were really hit hard by the fact that the sick leave policy on the part of the railway companies was very, very restrictive. They basically just couldn't get time off, even if they had something like COVID-19. So that obviously was very upsetting for a lot of workers. And so now that there's a little more leverage in the labor side of the equation in the economy, unions have been trying to push those rail companies to give some concessions in that area. And that's been a particular sticking point for the rail companies. So this is not a new thing. This has actually been happening for like a year now. They've been going back and forth for a while. And it was looking like there might be a strike just before the election, but supposedly representatives from the U.S. government, specifically the Biden presidency, the Biden administration, talked to the unions, and they agreed, sort of, to an agreement with the rail companies. But I noted, somewhat cynically, that almost immediately after the election in November, the unions backed out of that agreement. So I kind of suspect that the unions basically were told that a big strike right before a major election would be bad news for Democrats, which of course are nominally the more pro-union party in the United States. So the unions probably agreed to the agreement temporarily, effectively, to try to ensure that there wasn't anything disruptive going on in the economy just before the election. But now that the election's over, they've been able to start up negotiations again, and they've started threatening strikes again, which would be very disruptive. Obviously, logistics are an important part of the economy and have an important impact on prices, which have already been going up, for a variety of reasons. And given how important logistics are, a rail strike would just be very no bueno. It would be very disruptive. So that's something that people who have kind of people who watch the business news have been trying to keep track of. Nothing has happened yet, but if something did happen, you would definitely hear about it. It would definitely make waves.
Seems weird to me that you would have something like no sick leave for employees of a department. What are you supposed to do? Are there any other
I
industries like that?
Probably. I mean, lots of jobs just have very weak benefits packages for workers.
Uh-huh.
So, even those that have been unionized sometimes have somewhat archaic agreements with their unions. It basically just comes down to leverage.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the unions just don't have the leverage. They need to kind of get everything they want, even something basic like sick leave.
Well, they could get some silk bugs and then buy some warships.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think that would work these days. I don't think you could get enough money
They
to
wouldn't get
build a
arm
modern
twisted.
navy.
They could get their
Yeah.
sick days.
Yeah, if you could build a modern navy out of textiles exports, then Bangladesh would be a superpower. But that's not happening. The terms of trade are no longer quite so favorable to silk producers, unfortunately. Doesn't quite work anymore. Did you see the flooding in Portugal? I think that was on Reddit.
I did not.
I'll send you a thing. Let's see, Neuro. There we go. Yeah, just unusually heavy rains, and the capital ended up getting flooded.
Hmm.
Pretty dramatic footage. Although I guess it wasn't that damaging. People didn't really seem like they were in danger. But it was definitely a lot of water.
Well, that's inconvenient.
I guess I'll throw out the usual disclaimer now while I've got it in the back of my head. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. So, if I ever get anything wrong, or if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know if I'm wrong. I want to know more than anybody. So, participation in chat is encouraged in that regard. Let's see.
Chat says, can you ask Agent Smith about the German coup?
Oh, and you didn't hear about that, right?
Man, I've been working constantly this whole week. No, I heard of nothing.
Oh man, well, I've got some news for you.
Okay.
Yeah, the German government arrested several dozen people as part of what they said was a coup plot in Germany.
Hmm.
I don't think it was ever really going to succeed. I didn't get the impression from what I was reading that they had any kind of like sophisticated plan in place. From what I read, they were pretty much just planning on storming the Reichstag and then trying to just seize power, which, that's not how government works. You can't just occupy the legislature and then just declare yourself the government. You're
That
going to have
sounds
a
like
lot
an
of,
event that we had fairly recently.
yeah, yeah, we had something similar. It didn't go well for them.
So maybe a coup attempt, but not a very good coup attempt.
No,
Not super convincing.
not as such. I think more significant than, the fact that people were planning a coup was, sort of the escalation it represents. Because there's been a kind of a trend in certain, well, a specific subculture in Germany to try and delegitimize the government. And they've been getting more traction over time. And as the recent incident suggests, they've been getting more ambitious over time. Yeah, I think they call themselves the Reichsburgers, something like that. Kind of sounds like a hamburger if you're an American, but that's an actual subculture in Germany. And they're sort of the German equivalent to sovereign citizens here. I don't know if you've heard of them before, but they're their own breed of weird. They believe it's hard to get into all the details. It's super legalistic, but basically, they don't think that they're citizens of the United States. They think that they're sovereign and that the law doesn't apply to them. They have all these weird mental gymnastics and obscure legal arguments about why they can't be arrested for this, that, or the other reason, which frequently results in sometimes hilarious videos of themselves getting themselves into trouble. Getting tased by police, arrested. I think the dumbest one was a sovereign citizen who actually was driving in Mexico and tried to challenge police at a checkpoint. It went about as well as you would expect. Some people just think that they're the main character, as the kids say. So Germany has these people too.
I'm
They
the
don't
main
think-
character. I have plot armor.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, your plot armor does not apply against Mexican checkpoint police, as this guy found out.
You weren't in the script. You're supposed to let me through.
But the Reichsburgers, they don't think the German government is legitimate. They have this weird, obscure argument, basically, that the democratic government that was set up in Germany was never really the true legal government, and that the legal government of Germany is and remains the imperial German government as it existed, I think, in the 1920s or so. No, it would have been before the 20s.
So
Before World War
One?
One. Yeah, before World War One. So for them, that's the true government, even though it hasn't existed in, a long time now.
These
And so
kind of
they're,
weird things that it's almost like it gives you a nostalgia hit of like people are still connected to that time because that seems really far away to me.
yeah, well, I mean, you don't want to do the Nazis, obviously. I
Yeah.
think that's illegal in Germany. The Weimar Republic was kind of a failure, so that's not attractive. And of course, presumably one of the main drivers of this behavior is disenchantment with the current regime in Germany, which of course is the liberal democratic regime created after the war. So that kind of leads you to the imperial government from the Bismarck era. So it kind of makes sense in a way if you think about it like that, but it's still very deeply weird, as I'm sure Germans would tell you.
Yeah, German people in the chat are saying that they believe that they're still under the control of the US.
Yeah, I've heard that. That's a pretty common narrative amongst a lot of the fringes of European political politics. Far left and far right actually both sort of share that perspective.
It kind of
Yeah,
sounds
there's
a
this.
little bit like deep state kind of thinking, where there's like some super actor that it's actually pulling the strings behind everything.
Yeah, yeah, that's probably the main attraction there. Although to be fair, there has been substantive criticism from more, measured experts in the field of international relations that argue that Europe definitely kind of free rides on the United States, and that in so much as it does, it makes itself inordinately dependent and on the United States, and by extension, inordinately vulnerable to U.S. pressure. So in that sense, Europe kind of goes along with the United States just for the sake of doing so, so it doesn't have to spend a lot of money on the military or otherwise go on expensive misadventures overseas to defend abstract interests like access to energy or security operations, like trying to deal with terrorism in countries that have somewhat unpalatable governments. It's the kind of stuff that pretty much any government has to do to a degree, but Europe doesn't have to do it as much because the United States just kind of does it for them. Doesn't stop them from backseat driving, although some of that backseat driving does raise legitimate points. Can't say Iraq was exactly a genius move, but so it goes. But it's not as though Europe does not have the choice to go its own way. I mean, they could. The United States is not actually stopping them. I think that's really the principal point of disagreement between sort of the fringe political view of Europe as being a puppet of the United States and the more substantive criticism from academics. Academics would not argue that Europe can't become independent because of US conspiring. Rather, they think that Europe just doesn't really want to. They just don't have the incentive. Whereas the conspiracy theorists argue that the United States, and specifically the CIA, engages in malign puppet mastery of European politics in order to keep them on side of the US foreign policy agenda.
Yeah, I guess the counter question for me would be, well, who else's side would they want to be on, based
Well,
on
their
that?
own. I mean, Europe has the power, if they worked collectively, to build a large military that could project force around the world, to have a globe-beating economy. I mean, the European Union is already the world's largest economy, if you measure it as a single unit. So they've got a lot of innate power, so to speak, a lot of innate inert power that they're not really using right now. Partly because they just find it difficult to coordinate. Obviously there's a lot of differences in opinion amongst different states in Europe about how to use Europe's collective power, or whether they even want to use it at all. But they could. So among the people that are critical of the United States, they're not saying that Europe should ally with Russia or China. They just think that Europe should stand on its own and try to have an independent foreign policy that serves their own interests
Oh, like
above and
Brexit.
beyond any. Oh, kinda, kind of like Brexit. That's sort of similar logic.
That went well.
Yeah, it could have gone better. Honestly, it's actually not a bad analogy because I don't know really the degree to which people think through this kind of thinking. I mean, yes, Europe has a lot of inert power that they could use and a lot of potential, but the reality is that the continent is still riven with a lot of internal disagreements. Certainly they agree on more than they disagree, but the idea that Europe is going to be some kind of unified globe-trotting empire or superpower of any kind, that's pretty unlikely given where they are right now.
Mm.
So I don't think it's really a fair criticism entirely. Europe is not sticking with the United States out of some dependency or because of manipulation. It's really just more because it's the path of least resistance.
Mm.
It's just the easiest way to ensure security and prosperity on the continent without having to engage in the sort of European diplomacy of trying to coordinate, 30 plus different states on the continent, which is akin to herding cats. You can't do it really.
Mm.
France would like to try. France has been trying for a very long time. For a very long time, France has seen the European Union as sort of their avenue back to global status. And they've tried very hard to try to make themselves out to be the leaders of Europe and to create unified European institutions in that vein. But no matter how hard they try, they always meet some kind of problem or resistance, and their efforts end up coming to naught. And I think the axiom is that the Germans could lead Europe but don't want to. The French want to but can't. And then the UK just isn't interested,
Mm.
basically. It took a lot of politicking just to convince people in Britain that joining the EU was a good idea, although it wasn't called the EU in the 70s. At that time, it was still the European Economic Community. But the idea of joining was hugely contentious in Britain, back then. And the referendum basically, well, I don't think they had a referendum in the 70s, did they? Maybe somebody from Britain would know better than me. But basically, they just barely made it in. And then people who were against it never stopped complaining about it until they eventually got their way and the UK finally actually left. Yeah, there's been some rumors in the UK actually that the British government might be thinking about trying to have a closer trading relationship with the European Union, which does not sound exciting, but keep in mind the whole point of Brexit was distancing the UK from the European Union so that the UK could engage in more trade with other countries. But there really has not been a lot of traction in terms of the UK government's ability to start negotiating and finalizing new trade agreements. It's been pretty slow. The United States in particular has not really prioritized it. I think partly they're a victim of bad timing in that sense, because right now the United States is going through one of its little protectionist phases. There's people are kind of turning on international trade and are very skeptical about it, and the Biden administration has kind of learned the lesson from 2016 in that regard and has been a little gun shy about, true free trade as we would have thought of it 10 years ago. And the result is that the UK's entreaties to negotiate a free trade agreement have not really been reciprocated, at least not yet. And, we all saw the drama with, the previous prime minister of the UK and, how the markets reacted to her plan to try to radically reform economic policy in the UK. So I think the new government is kind of thinking in more conventional terms now. They're not really in creative mode like the Brexiteers were back in 2016. And from their perspective, the future is probably going to be one of austerity, somewhat higher taxes, and probably more trade with Europe. Europe is just the obvious trade partner for the UK. And so easing trade barriers between the UK and Europe just makes a lot of intuitive economic sense. Now, there were some journalists that asked the British government if, the rumors were true and they were actually thinking about this, and basically London denied it. They just said that, no, we're not thinking about this. We're going to try to get everything we can out of Brexit. We're going to take advantage of the opportunities therein and make the most of the new normal in Britain, which could be true. But, governments have been known to lie. It's not unheard of. So I kind of suspect that if they are thinking about this, they're going to keep it quiet, because obviously Brexit is still a contentious issue in UK politics. So I suspect if they are thinking about liberalizing trade with Europe, they're probably going to do it quietly, and they're going to do it incrementally. So it's not going to be like one big trade agreement that restores British access to the European market. Probably they're just going to do little agreements here and there to try to make trade easier. And then in the accumulative, over time, it's going to amount to a much closer, tighter trading relationship. Yeah, it
Chat,
must be hard. Sorry?
Chat is asking, what are the reasons why Germany doesn't want to lead the EU?
Well, there's a simple answer and a complicated answer. Which would you prefer?
We'll start with the simple one.
World War II.
Oh, fair
That's the
enough.
simple one. Yeah.
It'd be a bit awkward.
Yeah. It's it's been a long time. World War II was a long time ago, but the historical memory therein has kind of become embedded in German institutions, particularly German foreign policy and German politics. So one of the implicit norms that was established in German politics after World War II is that Germany should not be assertive on the world stage. They should strive more than anything to have a cooperative multilateral foreign policy and to try to do things in conjunction with other nations rather than trying to impose any kind of will. And that worked for a long time, and it helped kind of repair Germany's image. But the trouble, of course, is that Germany is a very successful country. The economy has done very well over time. And the result is that even though Germany's economy is very large, the diplomatic and political role they play in Europe is not quite up to snuff. It's not proportionate to their economic power, you might say. And that suits the German government fine. They don't mind that. They don't mind taking a back seat to international negotiations within the European Union about policy. But it also means that they're a little gun shy. They don't really like taking the lead on issues where there's an obvious leader needed. There's a lot of contentious issues in Europe, and it would be helpful if the most powerful member would use some of that power to try to resolve some of those issues. I mean, you can't always negotiate an agreement to a given problem in which there's consensus, in which everybody is happy. Sometimes you're going to have to lean on people in order to try to get some kind of resolution. Because if you don't, then problems just kind of go unresolved, and the only solutions that can be implemented are half solutions that don't really solve anything. And really, Europe is just replete with problems that are long running but have just remained unresolved because of a lack of agreement. Now, if there were a more assertive power in Europe that could maybe use their power to lean on countries that are kind of impeding progress in some regards, maybe those problems could be resolved in a more substantive way. But as is, the only country in Europe that could do that is Germany, and Germany just has it in their institutional culture that they can't do that. And right now, they don't want to. So that's kind of the simple answer. It's sort of a leftover legacy policy from World War II. But there's also a more complex answer, which is that they don't want to because it's expensive. If you want to be some kind of hegemon, like a regional hegemon, like Germany could be in Europe, that would mean propping up allies. That would mean spending a lot of money to shore up alliances. It would be expensive. They would have to spend a lot more money in the European Union to try to get their way on this, that, or the other policy. As is, they can just leave problems unresolved and keep their money for themselves. And that's actually fairly palatable for the German body politic. We've kind of seen this manifest with the recent energy crisis in Europe that happened after the invasion of Ukraine. So energy prices obviously spiked after the invasion. There were shortages of natural gas. There were issues with oil, issues with diesel fuel, just lots of problems in the energy sector. So one of the proposed solutions was for there to be a combined policy at the European Union level to distribute funds to all the different countries so that they could use those funds to support their businesses and help subsidize energy consumption, or alternatively, to help their consumers with the higher prices so that they didn't bite as much. Now, for various reasons, this didn't happen. And Germany, for its part, ended up doing this anyway, but at a national level. They ended up spending several hundred billion euros on subsidies to German business and German consumers. Now, of course, that's all politically fine for Germany, but from the outside of Germany, there was a lot of criticism. People perceived that as Germany using their successful, economy and their government's disproportionate access to international lending to prop up and give German industry an unfair advantage. The unfair advantage stemming from the fact that other governments just did not have the resources to support their own industries in the same fashion. So in that sense, they thought the Germans were being a little selfish, in a sense. So that's the kind of problem that this sort of insularity breeds. On the one hand, nobody can really criticize Germany for throwing their weight around, although they have done that to a degree, but really not nearly as much as they could. So nobody can say they're really being Nazis or trying to take over Europe or anything. They've been pretty restrained overall. But the downside is that Europe really lacks the force and conviction of its most powerful nation state. And that means that there's just not nearly the degree of problem-solving capability that the continent really needs to resolve some of the thornier issues. Russia, energy, terrorism, security generally, immigration, like all of this is stuff that Germany could throw their weight around and probably reach some kind of consensus policy solution to, albeit one that wouldn't make everybody happy. But they're not going to do that. So that's part of the reason, too, why Germany does not want to lead. It's going to be expensive, people will be upset with them, and they're not interested in taking on the hassle effectively. Much easier to just remain insular and take care of their own affairs and just continue to try to free ride on the sort of borderline stagnation of the multilateral institution that is the European Union.
Why doesn't Germany lead the EU? It's expensive.
Yeah, people want their money. If you want to play politics, got to have something to offer, and money goes a long way. Yeah, the United States kind of knows this from experience. We spend a good deal of money on various foreign adventures. I mean, what was it? It's just trillions of dollars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And a lot of that wasn't even necessarily money to the military. There's a lot of attempts made to try to prop up the economy, give foreign aid, all this kind of stuff. So, trying to buy allies and buy stability in other countries, it costs money. So I don't really begrudge Germany entirely for eschewing it. Yeah, between France and Germany, the UK was pretty much one of the natural leaders of Europe for a long time, in the European Union, although also before the European Union. And for a long time, people in the European Union kind of noted that the UK was often, well, the British government, I should say, was often the voice of reason in debates within the European Union. And they do kind of miss that, although they don't also know that the UK is entirely capable of that at this point either. It's not just that the UK left the EU, they seem to have forgotten to take their sense with them. So politics have been a little bit dysfunctional in the UK since 2016. And people in Europe no longer really see the UK as kind of the voice of reason. They see it as being a little batshit crazy at this point.
Chat was asking about any benefits of Brexit for the UK.
Benefits.
Yeah, anything good that they have as a result of it?
Some of that depends on perspective. So if you're a Brexiteer, pro-Brexit, one of the principal benefits was immigration. So they didn't have to depend on, these sort of rules and restrictions that had been laid down by the European Union bureaucracy. So they have more control over that. There's also the EU's judiciary. What's the phrase I want? The European Union Court. I think that's what it's called. So Brexiteers really didn't like the court, and they wanted to try to remove any oversight the European Union Court had over the UK. So in so much as that was achieved, that's another positive. Supposedly, it also allowed them to negotiate free trade deals that allowed more access and, were basically more ambitious than they could have done in the EU, in the European Union. Although, of course, that comes with the opportunity cost of losing privileged access to the European single market, which is not really a net gain, in my opinion. But People wanted to be able to do it, and they now are able to do so. They haven't actually been able to do much with the opportunity, but it is there at least. So supposedly that's also a win. I think deregulation is sort of the secret sauce of Brexit, because I think a lot of conservative Brexiteers saw in Brexit an opportunity to create the kind of deregulated laissez-faire market that they could not really have while they were still in the European Union. So even though they never came out and said, let's leave the European Union so that we can become an American style capitalist country, I kind of suspect that a lot of them had that in the back of their heads. And you can kind of see some of that, with Liz Truss. She had like her tax cut plan, and the free trade plan often involved, implicit acceptance of what was going to be concessions on this, that, or the other aspect of the economy. Like negotiations with the United States would have involved almost certainly liberalization of restrictions on food imports, which would have involved basically lower standards and fewer restrictions on how foodstuffs could be produced. So backdoor deregulation, I think, was kind of one of the goals there. And more recently, with the new government under Sunak, he's announced recently that they're going to deregulate the financial sector. It's not like a full-blooded deregulation. I noted that some of the fine print was basically that they were going to restrict some of it to just sort of small and medium-sized financial businesses. But they are going to try to look at this, and there's going to be pretty significant changes to the way finance is regulated, and most of it is going to come in the form of deregulation. So obviously people are pretty skeptical about that. I mean, deregulated finance is what contributed to the 2008 financial crisis. So that's kind of what people are thinking of when the government announced this. But nominally, this is something that you can do specifically because of Brexit. Because the UK is outside of the EU, they can go out and deregulate their financial sector much more than they could have and try to get a bigger share of the global financial market. Of course, by deregulating, you're also taking on more risk, but obviously the current government sees that as a risk worth taking. It doesn't hurt that the financial sector in Britain is one of the main drivers of the economy. It's a principal pillar over there. So if they want the UK economy to really develop, that means trying to push that sector. The previous governments over the past couple of years have tried to focus more on diversification. They want to try to create new firms and sectors that can employ more people in some of the northern regions of the UK that have sort of suffered from deindustrialization. But a lot of those plans have basically just either failed or haven't come to anything. So the current government, instead of making some broad-based pie-in-the-sky promises about, building whole new industries and reindustrializing Britain, they're focusing more on the industry in which they already have a comparative advantage and which is disproportionately responsible for driving GDP and economic growth, that again being finance. So it does make sense that they would focus on that. But again, if you're a Brexiteer, you can kind of credit Brexit with the fact that the government can do that at all. So in that sense, that is also a win, quote unquote, from Brexit.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on finance or anything by any stretch, but I know a lot of people, like my father, is a lot more laissez-faire when it comes to finance and business, where he likes the idea of less regulation, where it's easier for you to start up a business and not have to jump through as many hoops and pay as many taxes, which that does mean that companies can do some weird stuff, which might not be good, but it also means that if you're thinking about where to set up a new company, setting it up in a place that's going to have fewer strings and fewer restrictions means that you have more potential for fast growth. So it's kind of like more of a dice rolly, like just frontier of being able to take risks and see if they pay off. Whereas adding regulations makes things a little bit slower overall, but more stable potentially.
Yeah, that's generally the trade-off. Yeah, the British government is pretty desperate for economic growth at this point. The economy's been stagnating for a long time now. It's not really fully stagnant. They have generated some growth, but it's not really nearly enough, certainly given the debt burden the government is operating under. So if they can just generate some, that would really help a lot in boosting tax revenue and helping them try to pay down some of the immense debt that the government is suffering from. So I think that's why they're looking at this rather than something like an industrial policy or maybe some other approach that might focus a little more on some of the poorer regions. I think at this point, they just want to go with what they think is the most intuitive choice of target. Again, that being the financial sector.
Does Britain have any other natural resources and stuff?
They used to have a lot of coal and iron, but beyond that, not really. I think they produce a lot of natural gas, if I'm not mistaken.
There's a
I
fart
think that's
joke in here
mostly,
somewhere.
well, well, there's that. But I think more specifically, I was thinking of the North Sea. Yeah, I think Scotland, in its sort of northern reaches out in the ocean, has some territory that where there's significant reserves of natural gas. Or is it oil? Pretty sure it's natural gas. Let me check that. Oh, okay. So it's oil and natural gas. Well, there you go. So they do have some oil and natural gas that they pump out of the ocean in and around Scotland. But I don't think it's enough to be fully self-sufficient. I think it just generates a lot of revenue, but beyond that, it just kind of puts a dent in imports. But yeah, beyond that, not really. It's not really a resource-rich island in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty much manufactured goods and services are what their economy depends on. And at this point, it's mostly services. And they do produce high quality stuff. I mean, not just finance, but stuff like video games, software, uh, research and development, stuff like that. The sort of stuff that requires a lot of human capital. Very educated workforce, expertise, access to capital. Rule of law, that kind of stuff. London and the UK generally actually have a pretty strong comparative advantage in.
Mm-hmm.
So even if the broader economy kind of struggles and the working man is having a rough time, for college educated people and especially, really elite level people who can kind of lead their industries, the UK remains pretty strong in those specific niche areas of the global economy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the United States actually signed an agreement that was sort of, I think there was a bilateral agreement, and then there was also another agreement that was part of the AUKUS agreement that was made with Australia, the US, and the UK. And both of those agreements basically involved the United States and the UK, and to a lesser degree, Australia, all cooperating together on certain cutting edge new technologies like supercomputers, artificial intelligence, stuff like that. And they do very well in those areas. So, British expertise definitely still has a lot of value. It just doesn't employ people with high school educations. Therein lies the rub. That's the fundamental sort of public policy puzzle of the era. As we develop an economy in which labor is increasingly automated, what do you do with people who do not have the educational background and skills, advanced skills, to take advantage of a new advanced economy that is emerging in developed countries? Those people increasingly don't have a lot of alternatives beyond the traditional low to medium wage factory work that they've traditionally been employed in. So whoever can answer that question will be very popular in public policy circles. Yeah, squaring that circle is going to be real difficult. If I had to guess, just for the sake of conversation and speculation, if I had to guess, I would suspect that labor-intensive manufacturing industries are going to end up getting a special protected status, like agriculture is now. Because right now, we have a lot of free trade regimes and rules and whatnot, like, the WTO and NAFTA, the EU, etc. But even with all of those, free trade rules in place, exceptions are still carved out for agriculture. So you do have to allow access to your market, but Unlike with manufactured goods, governments are still allowed, according to pretty much all free trade agreements, to give subsidies to their own farmers. And that's because food is seen as a sufficiently important strategic asset and national security interest that that is considered necessary. And nobody really complains about it. Everybody is pretty happy to be allowed to subsidize their farmers and grow a disproportionate share of their own food. So I suspect we could see something similar with labor-intensive manufacturing, because generating jobs for people with high school educations who need uh, decent paying jobs that are accessible to them is going to be increasingly important. Because countries in which there's just a large chunk of the population that is unemployed and basically just can't find work no matter what, those countries are in for some instability, not least because a disproportionate share of those people are almost invariably going to be young men. And if there's one consistent variable throughout history, across cultures and continents, it's that angry young men always and forever fuck things up for everybody, without fail. They are easily the catalyst for almost all, or at least the most catastrophic mayhem that plagues societies.
Testosterone.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's not the best thing for social stability. So I think increasingly governments will see that as an imperative. And again, this is me just speculating, but one potential solution could then be that certain industries are designated as important and will be given, special protected status in which governments will be allowed to subsidize them, not because they want to produce some strategic good like food or, even semiconductors or something like that, but just because they want to generate the jobs for people so that those jobs will be available for those who maybe can't get access to jobs that have more of a barrier to entry in terms of skill set. I don't know how feasible that is because it seems like there's not really that many labor intensive industries anymore. But it's possible that there could be enough left and a small enough number of people who need those specific jobs in the future that maybe that could be a viable way forward. If nothing else, it would be good politics, because then politicians could say, yes, you've been screwed over by modernity, but look, we have this whole new regime set up where our jobs are basically protected just for your benefit. And in that sense, governments can preserve their legitimacy even if they haven't necessarily fundamentally resolved the underlying problem and puzzle there. Thorny question. We'll see what happens with it.
Yeah, that links into a lot of the other just general existential questions about with the future and automation and new jobs that come up and jobs that are rendered obsolete. What do people do, especially if they're not seeking higher education to deal with the modern shit? How many traditional jobs will survive? People in the chat are saying that being a plumber is always going to be a high demand job. That's true.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. When the water starts rising, the plumber's phone starts ringing.
Yep.
Ice water is good stuff.
True. Putting ice in the water is a very American thing to do as well. You kind of just showed your nationality by that statement.
I thought I gave it away when I said I was from Texas, but fair point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've gotten commentary from foreign friends about that before, specifically when I was in grad school. They were all somewhat bemused and amused that I had ice in my water. It's just a normal thing here. What else did we have? Sending more money to Taiwan. That what doesn't surprise anybody. Are you familiar with the NDAA?
No. Non-Disclosure Agreement Association?
Good guess, but no.
Damn.
No, this is the National Defense Authorization Act. And it's the act that's passed every year that funds the U.S. military for the next year. So there's always politicking around a given year's NDAA. not least by, the departments of the military itself, which all compete with each other for money, but also around, strategy, prioritization, etc. So this year, one of the things that's in the new act or bill, however it's called, new money for Taiwan. We're going to try to help them out. And, mostly it's just money for them to buy stuff or just us literally just giving them stuff. But one of the interesting notes that I saw, one of the sort of more marginal parts of it was what was called the Taiwan Fellowship Act, which apparently is a program for US government employees to live in Taiwan for 2 years. And while they're there, they're going to study, well, they're going to do two things. One, they're going to study Chinese and learn the language, obviously. They're supposed to do that in the first year. In the second year, they're actually supposed to work in one of Taiwan's ministries or agencies. And after, their 2 year term is complete, they're supposed to work for some fixed period, quote unquote, advancing US interests in Indo-Pacific, with emphasis on Taiwan ties. But I thought that was a really interesting idea to actually have US government workers working in Taiwan's government. I was a little surprised that the Taiwan government was willing to tolerate that. Because if you know anything about Chinese history, you know that one of the sticking points, or maybe I should say one of the sore points in China's history, is of course how the country was treated by Western empires. And one of the things Western empires did is force the Chinese government to agree to allow Westerners to serve in China's customs bureau. And it was actually Westerners and Western appointed officials that actually collected tariffs as part of the Chinese customs regime for a long time. And, they actually did it pretty efficiently overall, although there was, the usual amount of corruption for the 19th century. But the Chinese kind of remember this as part of their century of humiliation. So I was a little surprised to hear that the United States included this in the bill because it kind of seemed a little impolitic, almost. Not politic, I should say. I kind of wonder how this would be received in Taiwan. Certainly, I know exactly how it's going to be received on the mainland. They're going to be very critical of anything the U.S. does with Taiwan. But, even Taiwan itself, I was a little surprised. So we'll see. And, like I was mentioning before, back in the 19th century, early 20th century, some countries trying to modernize would actually invite Western professionals, like lawyers, judges, veterans, etc., to come and help them develop new institutions. And so they actually had foreigners, Westerners specifically, working in their government. So this also kind of reminded me of that. Taiwan, I don't think they're going to be appointed to be like the head of these ministries or anything. Probably they're going to be in some kind of junior position, but having Westerners working in the government at all kind of seemed very interesting to me. I don't think that very many governments do that anymore. If only for nationalistic reasons. It's kind of bad politics. Any government job given to a foreigner is a job that could have gone to a native citizen. And it seems like a government doing that opens itself to, easy criticism from rivals. So I'm just curious to see how that particular plan pans out. It seems like an interesting idea with potential for negative repercussions, depending on how locals receive it. Oh, wow, it's already 10 o'clock. Time flies.
Today's Agent Smith has been fun.
Yeah, a little all over the place. What else did we have here? Got some trade tension between the EU and the US. Had you heard about this?
No,
So, do you remember the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed whenever, like a month or two ago, whenever it was?
think so. Yeah.
Yeah, that was not the CHIPS Act. The CHIPS Act was the one where they were supporting the semiconductor industry. Inflation Reduction Act was nominally about reducing inflation. Actually, it was more of an environmental bill than anything. Lots of subsidies there for this, that, and the other green industry and whatnot. But among the subsidies in the bill was one that subsidized the purchase of electric vehicles. So if you're a consumer, you want to buy a electric vehicle, then under the bill, you would actually get a rebate, basically. in exchange for that. Or maybe it's the car company that gets the rebate in exchange. I don't remember exactly, but it's a subsidy for sure. And the issue, though, is that there's a caveat, which is that the subsidy only applies, that is to say, you're only eligible for the subsidy if the electric vehicle in question was assembled in the United States. So it has to be an American-made vehicle. And this is technically illegal, according to commitments under the World Trade Organization and probably a couple other trade treaties that the United States has. And the result is that the European Union in particular is very upset with the United States government about this, and they've been complaining vociferously. It might not be too big a deal because the law, that is to say, the Inflation Reduction Act, is also written to suggest that exceptions could be made to this restriction for allied countries or partner countries. The wording is a little ambiguous, basically. And the Biden administration has kind of hinted that, maybe Europe could apply and be eligible for such an exception. But they haven't really come out and said that explicitly. So the Europeans are not really convinced at this point. They're pretty deeply skeptical of US intentions on this particular subject matter. And it's important for them because, of course, one of the major industries in Europe is the automotive industry, especially in Germany. And electric vehicles are thought to be the next big thing, the next big item that people are going to be buying. And so having and retaining access to the US car market, which is, I believe, the second largest on the planet, is a pretty important priority for them. So the prospect that they might be cut out of the electric vehicle market, which in effect could be what the bill does, if American cars are subsidized and foreign cars are not, then you're probably going to buy American. So the Europeans want to make sure explicitly that the US government is committed to non-discrimination, at least as far as its partner countries in Europe. But whether or not the US government actually does that is a little up in the air. Again, we're living in an era where people are very skeptical of free trade, and there's a lot of unmet political demand in the United States for the US government to provide more protections for American producers and to generate more jobs in the United States by catering specifically to the American market. So that being the case, there's a little bit of hesitance on the part of Washington to really extend these exceptions. I think if they'd really wanted to, they would have done it by now and just made it clear. As is, they kind of want to ambiguate a bit so that they can placate the trade skeptical part of the US body politic. So I don't think this will escalate too much. There's been trade spats between Europe and the United States before, and the electric vehicle market is still not that big a market yet. It's still not, it still has not supplanted the market for traditional cars. So there's still time to kind of sort this out before it really has too negative a consequence for European car makers. So I wouldn't read too much into hyperventilating by either the United States or Europe on this matter. Mostly, I suspect, that's more posturing for negotiations than anything. I suspect at this point, the EU just wants to make sure that it's clear to the US that this is going to be an issue and that they're not going to let it drop, rather than them really making this a life or death issue that has to be resolved right now. If the Europeans did not say anything right now and then later on tried to make it a big issue, they would have less leverage, because then the United States could just accuse them of being opportunistic, and they could ask, well, why didn't you make this an issue before? Where were these complaints when we passed this bill 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whenever? So the Europeans are just trying to cover their bases here. Trade negotiations have lots of gamesmanship in them, so you can think of this as the kind of thing your lawyer would do during a difficult trial. There's always all these weird little tricks that lawyers do, and positioning for a given case. So it's effectively not any different for a free trade negotiation. It's a very similar process. Let's see. Oh, yeah, there was another item. The Europeans were mad at the US because of natural gas. So the United States has been supplying Europe with natural gas to try to relieve the pressure from being locked out of the Russian market for natural gas, specifically Russian exports. And some European countries are a little upset that the US government is selling the natural gas at market prices. It sounds a little weird. In the United States, we have more of a private sector driven, economy. So it's not really up to the government to determine how, and what price natural gas is sold at, which has been the defense that Washington has fielded. They basically say that European complaints are unfounded because it's not Washington's job to manipulate prices. But that's also kind of a cop-out argument, because if they really wanted to, they could jump out and subsidize those sales so that they were cheaper for the Europeans and so that there was more burden sharing as far as the cost of importing American natural gas. So, from the European perspective, there's a lack of burden sharing on the part of their American ally, in a sense. And they would prefer to see more on the natural gas front in particular, given how expensive it is. But from the US perspective, our budget is already kind of busted a bit right now. We're already dumping loads of money into Ukraine. We're dumping a bunch of money into industrial policy more recently, especially semiconductors. And there's a lot of debt. We racked up so much debt over the course of the pandemic, and then because of the Trump tax cuts, and then quantitative easing, and that whole period after the global financial crisis. The bill is getting big. So I think Washington is a little wary of making new commitments, especially on such a large scale. So I don't expect that the European complaints on this count are going to go anywhere. And I think once once the terminal, there's a natural gas terminal in the southern United States that's responsible. I think it's specifically Louisiana, that's responsible for exporting like a disproportionate share of American natural gas exports. And there was actually a fire there a couple months ago, and it's actually been out of commission ever since. And it's a very ill-timed fire, I might add. I almost wondered if it wasn't Russian sabotage when I first heard about it, but it was probably just an accident. But that has not helped with the natural gas shortage. Yeah, a very strategically timed accident in the grand scheme of things. But that's probably going to be an issue until more natural gas can be produced and more natural gas can be exported specifically from the United States. And I think that terminal in question should be up and operational by next year. I think next spring is what I read, something like that. And so at that point, prices should fall a bit. Probably not enough to make people in Europe happy. I'm sure they prefer it be as cheap as Russian gas was before the war, but that's going to take a while. That's going to take much longer. They're working feverishly to try to build up supply and storage capacity and new liquid natural gas container terminals, but it's just going to take some time. It'll probably take a year or two before they're really able to seriously alleviate the pressure from higher natural gas prices.
Gas do be very expensive these days.
It's gotten a little cheaper in the US recently. Been kind of on the downswing. You can thank China's COVID policy for that.
How?
Well, the COVID restrictions under zero COVID were sufficiently restrictive that they actually pretty significantly impeded economic growth in China over the past year. And especially after the big announcements of restrictions in Beijing and Shanghai. Well, Shanghai was 2021, though, not 2022. But there were significant new announcements, and that significantly impinged on market sentiment to the point where price futures for oil took a dive, especially after summer, I believe it was. And so oil prices globally have kind of been on a downswing and stabilized since then, with the result that gasoline prices in the United States are cheaper than they were earlier in the year, which people are pretty pleased with, I think. Understandably so, given how high they had been.
Yeah, Americans relative to other countries too are more automotive dependent than
Yeah.
people in a lot of smaller countries, partly because our public transit sucks, but also because it's a very geographically large country. So if you're someone who travels from state to state, you don't really have public transit options aside from extremely slow buses.
Yeah, people in America really feel changes in gasoline prices.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they don't call it gasoline in Europe. I think they call it petrol in
Petrol.
Europe.
Yep.
Yeah. Sometimes there can be some confusion on that point. Got to gas up my car.
Hmm.
as we say here.
Do they say gas for natural gas?
Yeah.
I gotcha.
So when Americans say gas, they think we're talking about natural gas. And when they say gas, we think they're talking about gasoline. So tomato, tomato. It's just one of those things. What else did I have in here? Just kind of some miscellaneous notes basically today. We can go focus on some more particular topic if somebody wants, but otherwise I can just kind of run through these. Lots of interesting stuff happening, but it's just sort of intermittent notes.
Chat says if they say petrol for gas, what do they say for minerals?
Minerals?
It's a StarCraft
Oh,
joke.
oh, you got me. I was thinking, oh, I mean oil? No, no. Sure. Well played, sir. Oh, what's interesting? What would you guys like to hear about? It's Europe.
For anyone who's joining us late and was wondering about Peru, we covered that as the first item. So when we post the VOD, you can check that out.
Yeah, yeah, we jumped in.
Any random off the cuff countries you want an update on, chat?
Yeah, here you go. Oh, they did. Europe did finally pass that price cap on Russian oil.
Mm-hmm.
So that is policy now. And it is mostly focused on insurance companies. So specifically, maritime insurance companies cannot provide insurance for deals, that is to say, buyers uh, who are who are buying oil that is priced above the price cap. And if they do, they'll be punished because they'll be effectively breaking the law. So the idea there is to not deny access to maritime insurance from shipping companies specifically. And if shipping companies cannot get insurance for the transit of oil, they won't do it. Because, if you have some disaster and the ship sinks and spills a bunch of oil, that's going to be expensive. That's going to cost you a lot of money. And so nobody wants to pay that out of pocket, obviously. They need insurance for that. So if there's no insurance, no tankers, and hypothetically, much more difficult to move Russian oil. I thought some of the politicking around this was pretty interesting. So there was a desire to have the price cap very, very low on the part of Poland specifically. And other countries wanted it to be relatively high. And I think specifically Germany. And there was some debate about, where exactly it should be. The United States kind of came in and said that it should be relatively high. And the idea there was that the United States and Europe did not want to completely cut off Russia from the global oil market, partly out of self-interest. The idea was that that would significantly crimp global oil supplies and result in a spike in oil prices. And of course, that means more expensive energy, more expensive gasoline for cars, more expensive everything. And given inflation, such as it is, nobody wants that. So there was some pressure there, and that pressure ended up winning out to have the price cap be relatively high to prevent any kind of global inflationary pressure. It was probably never going to be a problem. I doubt they can really truly enforce this, because one of the big weaknesses in this approach is that there are what are called dark fleets, which are basically just fleets of oil tankers and transport ships and whatnot that operate off the grid, basically illegally and smuggle stuff illegally from country to country. I know it
Shadow
sounds
banks.
weird. Yeah.
It's like
Yeah,
that.
it's kind of maritime equivalent of shadow bank. I know it's weird to think of like an oil tanker as being something you can be clandestine with. I mean, they're so huge. How can you just sneak oil, from place to place? But it actually does happen. A lot of cases, what happens is that there is a legal ship as part of a legal deal will take oil from someplace like, say, Venezuela. And Venezuela has actually done this. And the tanker, the legal tanker, operating to the letter of the law, will sail out into the middle of the ocean. And then it'll meet another tanker that's part of the dark fleet. and they'll actually transfer the oil from tanker to tanker. And then the smuggler tanker effectively will then finish the trip and go to some location that they're not supposed to go to and unload the oil to the customer who's not supposed to have it. So that's not uncommon. And most likely that's what's going to happen with Russian oil. If there's not a sufficient number of tankers that can legally service that market, they're going to be replaced by the dark fleet tankers. So realistically, you can't cut off Russia from the oil market. There's always going to be somebody who's willing to smuggle and bust sanctions. But you can make the oil a little more expensive, basically. You can make it just a little harder. Well, not more. Actually, it would be discounted in that case. You can lower the price for Russian oil by making it a little more difficult to get.
We did have a couple countries they wanted updates on. Kosovo.
Kosovo. So you wanted to hear about the license plate drama.
Multiple people did, and we had two people say Kosovo.
I haven't been really following it too closely. I think the Serbs are just making noise for the sake of making noise. The Serbs have a nationalist government right now, and so part of their legitimacy stems from trying to get Kosovo back. They've never given up on that. Do you remember Kosovo?
No.
Okay, so I can kind of recap that for you. So many moons ago, in an era called the 1990s, there was a country called Yugoslavia. And they had a bit of a problem, which is that the country disintegrated. And as a result of different components of the country declaring independence, a civil war ensued that was exceedingly brutal. I think most people my age probably remember seeing stuff in the news back in the 90s about the wars in Yugoslavia and the refugees and the genocide, and it was very bad. So one of the catalysts for the wars in Yugoslavia was nationalism. Specifically Serb nationalism in particular. I don't want to put the entire onus for the war on the Serbs. That would not be fair. There was other ethnic nationalisms at play, but Serb nationalism in the 80s was one of the early catalysts for the disintegration of Yugoslavia. And part of that had to do with ethnic tension between ethnic Serbs in Serbia and ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. Now, Kosovo at that time was a territory that was in the south of Serbia. It was actually part of Serbia. It was one of two autonomous provinces within Serbia. There was Serbia proper, and then there was the autonomous province of, what was it, Vojvodina or something, which I think still exists. And then there was also the autonomous province of Kosovo. And the thing about Kosovo is that historically, it's sort of been like very important to the Serbian people. It was like their origin point. A lot of Serbian history has important ties to Kosovo, and the ethnic Serb population has traditionally been the dominant population there. But over time, the demography changed, and by the 1980s, the majority population was ethnic Albanian. And for a while, that wasn't too big a deal. But then there was some conflict. I think specifically there was like a farmer that had some kind of, I don't know, he did something violent. I think it had some, I'm not even going to, there's a weird story there, but I'm not going to get into it because I can't remember all of the details. But basically, there was incidences of violence that kind of spiraled out of control and eventually catalyzed Serbian nationalism and made it prominent again. And this is a grossly simplified version of this history, but just bear with me. I'm trying to focus specifically on Kosovo here. So part of the Yugoslav wars stemmed from ethnic tension between Serbs and Albanians in Kosovo. So the Yugoslav wars end, Serbia is still intact, and Kosovo is still part of Serbia. And for a while, that was okay. Again, late 90s. And then in 1999, ethnic conflict sparked and flared up again in Kosovo. And this time, the Serb military ended up going after basically ethnic Albanians. Now, the specific organization they were fighting with was called the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, if I'm not mistaken. And, it's the Balkans, so there was the usual Balkans conflict type of stuff, ethnic violence, atrocities, human rights abuses, to put it mildly. So that stuff was happening. the Kosovo, the ethnic Albanian population perpetrated some. So it's not as though their hands were entirely clean, but in general, the Serb military was easily more powerful and was more sort of responsible, you might say, in so much as they were in a position of authority. So they ended up getting disproportionately blamed for the ethnic violence in Kosovo. And the result was a NATO operation designed to protect the ethnic Albanian population and push the Serbian government out of Kosovo. I can't remember the name of that operation, but I think it was the one in which the United States accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in the Serbian capital of Belgrade. Very unfortunate and very awkward for the United States government. And to this day, people in China complain about it. I remember even in grad school, people, Chinese students I knew, would surprise me by bringing it up. We'd be talking about history or something, and they would mention that. And, pretty much all of them kind of asserted that they suspected we'd done it on purpose to embarrass them.
Oops, didn't mean to do that.
Yeah.
Just bomb them.
Yeah, I was kind of at pains to convince them that, it probably was just a dumb mistake. When you're bombing shit tons of targets in a big city like that, accidents happen. So it was an ugly conflict, and Serbs are still bitter about it to this day. They were already mad at NATO because NATO had intervened in the Civil War, in the mid 90s. They were even madder after the NATO intervened and basically pried Kosovo away from Serbia. Because again, they still thought of it as a core part of Serbian territory, and NATO effectively not only pushed the Serbian government out, but set up a de facto independent Kosovo government there. So Serbian nationalists have been furious about this from day one, and their long-term objective since then has been to restore Kosovo to Serbia. And they don't care about ethnic makeup, they don't care about the history. Like, Kosovo is part of Serbia to them, and the fact that it was separated was a crime perpetrated by an aggressive West, and more specifically NATO. And that's a super common perspective in Serbia, even amongst relatively liberal people. Lots of people were traumatized by the bombings of Belgrade back in the day. So that's sort of the background here. And, Kosovo, for its part, basically got a government that was pseudo-installed by the EU. There's a lot of EU institutions that kind of operate there on behalf of the local government. I think judicial institutions, and specifically, in particular. But the administrative side of the government is more run by local parties, specifically, descendants of the KLA. And I think for a long time there was kind of just stagnation. Kosovo was separate, did their own thing. Serbia was separate, did their own thing. Nobody was really happy about the status quo. The Serbs wanted Kosovo back, and the people of Kosovo wanted international recognition of their independence, which for the most part they got, but not everyone did. Russia in particular did not recognize them. Russia fancies itself the protector of the Slavs, and really in particular like Serbia. There's a kind of a historical relationship and friendship between Russia and Serbia that goes back a long ways. A lot of that comes from common opposition to the Ottoman Empire, but that's kind of a whole other conversation. Anyway, for a long time they were just separate, and the issue was kind of a frozen conflict, effectively. And eventually, a problem arose when Serbs in the northernmost part of Kosovo started to protest against the government. Kosovo is like 90% ethnic Albanian, but in the most northerly part of the country, there is a community on the border with Serbia that is like mostly Serbian. I think it's majority ethnic Serbian. And they started protesting against the government and demanding to be allowed to join Serbia. Not to move to Serbia, but specifically to have their town and their section of territory, like their little county, to allow it to be absorbed into Serbia. And of course, the Kosovo government was not willing to do that. And so there ended up being a bunch of protests, some riots. The Serbian government got involved. The Kosovo government protested. It turned into a big thing. Eventually, it didn't go anywhere, and the protests quieted down. But this community has continued to be a running sore in relations between Europe and Serbia, and more particularly between Kosovo and Serbia. I think the community is called Mitrovica, if I'm not mistaken. And whenever you hear about, Serbian unrest in Kosovo, that's almost certainly where the problem is. So, you can't entirely blame people there for wanting to, rejoin Serbia, I guess. But this is also like the worst nightmare for Europe as a whole, because of course Europe has a lot of institutional memories of the 1930s, and the 1930s, of course, saw a lot of disputes and conflicts and eventually a world war over borders. And those borders specifically were under dispute because different countries believed that the people who lived there belonged to their country because of a common ethnic identity. So a lot of those forces were unleashed by World War One, because before World War One, didn't matter what your ethnic group was, you were a part of the empire, you were just because of historical reasons, and there wasn't anything you could do about it. But after World War One, there's a sense that people should have their own sort of ethnic states. But of course, Europe had a lot of overlapping ethnic groups, spatially speaking. Everybody kind of lived with everybody. And so that raised some difficult questions about which specific territories should be part of which specific ethnic state. And in the 1930s, that just spiraled out, and a lot of opportunistic authoritarians took advantage of that, Hitler being the most famous one. So after World War II, making sure that nobody complained about borders was an important part of the new security regime designed for Europe. Nobody wanted to go through that, World War II specifically. Nobody wanted to go through World War II again. And so making sure that border disputes did not spiral out of control and did not become a thorn in European diplomacy became a primary objective. And that norm was established for decades. But then the Soviet Union collapsed, and then Yugoslavia collapsed. So the issue kind of returned. And Europe has been at pains to try to kind of tame Balkan-style nationalistic border disputes ever since. And the Mitrovica unrest really epitomizes why this is such a problem and why the Europeans really want to clamp down on this as much as possible, because there's no logical endpoint, right? You can go right down to like individual counties, towns, villages, as far as which country people want to live in. And it never ends. Like ethnic nationalism has no logical endpoint beyond conflict. So Europe has been very resistant to requests by Serbia to have Kosovo returned. But in turn, they've also been very resistant to the desire of the residents of Mitrovica to be allowed to have Serbia absorb their town. And it's kind of put the European Union in a very awkward place, because, of course, if you're an ethnic nationalist in Serbia, that reasoning sounds very anti-Serbian to you. It's okay to pick out Kosovo and tear that away from Serbia, but it's not okay for Mitrovica to rejoin Serbia. And to a lot of nationalist Serbians, that just illustrates the anti-Serb bias of the European Union. Now, for the European Union's part, they just don't want to have border conflicts at all, and they just don't really know how to deal with the Balkans' obsession with those borders. So the result has been a mixed bag of policies that doesn't really please anybody and has resulted in Serbia kind of becoming the continental bad guy. Well, other than Russia anyway. Maybe I should just say the Balkans. They're sort of the designated bad guy of the Balkans as far as a lot of Europe is concerned. And that's not really good for anybody. It's not good for Serbia. It's not good for Europe as a whole. It would be better if relations between Serbia and the rest of Europe could be normalized to some degree. But that's just not happened, and really kind of can't happen until the Kosovo issue can be satisfactorily resolved, which probably won't happen anytime soon. Because again, like I said, the current sitting government in Serbia is very much a nationalist government. And their attitude is very much that they can't do anything with Europe until Europe agrees to really allow them to have Kosovo back, which, of course, again, the European Union won't do. So stuck between a rock and a hard place, as the saying goes in the United States, for the European Union. So anyway, this conflict has been going on a while, and the residents of Mitrovica occasionally go out of their way to find something to complain about and protest about to try to illustrate their dissatisfaction with the current arrangement as far as the border. And the most recent thing this year has been license plates. So Kosovo has been requiring people all over the country to have specifically Kosovar license plates. Before, they had allowed people to have Serbian license plates, which of course a lot of people on the border had, because even if tensions between Serbia and Kosovo have been high, there's still trade going on. So people move back and forth, and people in Mitrovica in particular had Serbian license plates. So when the Kosovar government came out and said, You need to replace those with Kosovar license plates because you're part of Kosovo. People in Mitrovica, probably predictably, freaked out and they started protesting. And the Serb government noticed it and jumped in and said that the Kosovar government was oppressing the Serbs and that the Serbian government would help them as best that they could. And they haven't really done anything with that. They're not threatening war over it or anything, but they have issued, the usual litany of insults and threats to the European Union and Kosovo. So it's kind of been a sore point in European politics over the past year. Serbia is not really big enough to really challenge anybody over it, but it's kind of kicking normalization of relations down the road pretty considerably. That seems to be moving ever further onto the horizon for the moment. But again, like I said at the start, I think it's mostly just political theater. The Serb government is just engaging in theater to appease nationalist voters. People in Mitrovica are just, being themselves. They're Serb nationalists, so no surprises there. Kosovar government is just kind of following the letter of the law, at least as far as I know. So, that's not a shock. They probably should have expected pushback. So in that sense, an exception probably should have been made. But, it's also a nationalist government. Most Balkans governments are. So maybe that wasn't really politically viable either. So, as usual, the game theory in the Balkans is kind of a train wreck. Everybody is kind of playing chicken and nobody wants to swerve. Fortunately, the countries involved are sufficiently small and dependent on funds from the European Union that the rest of Europe can kind of keep things quiet, relatively speaking. But I think that's what people were talking about when they were asking about Kosovo. If I'm wrong, let me know. I would be interested to know what exciting goings on there's been that I missed out on. But as far as I know, that's been the main show.
Another one in the chat was Cambodia.
Oh, the base. Yeah, that's right. The Chinese have been setting up a base, and the United States government is going to do something about it. But I can't tell you what it is because I have not read that article yet.
But you saw the headline.
I saw the headline, yeah. I have a nice fat backlog of articles to read. I haven't gotten to that one yet. But yeah, the Chinese are moving forward with setting up a naval base in Cambodia. And I think the United States government was going to try to pressure the Cambodian government into restricting access to the port. But I don't think that's going to work. That's just not... you can put pressure on a country's economy, and by extension, the government, and that government might respond to that pressure by trying to give some kind of concession. But if the country in question is very corrupt, it's not really enough to pressure the economy as a whole. You need to pressure the personal finances of the people in charge. Because really it's them and their own personal network of friends and family that are the actual decision makers in that country. So even if you're punishing the country as a whole, it may be that their own personal commercial interests are not really sufficiently challenged to make them change, with the result that you're just making people in that country hate you for no obvious gain. So Cambodia, whatever other virtues it may have, is not known for its lack of corruption. And its political system in particular has been drifting back towards more authoritarianism over the past 5 to 10 years. And correspondingly, the relationship between Cambodia and China has improved quite a bit. And of particular interest in that regard has been the significant increase in investment by Chinese actors into Cambodia. A lot of those actors are legitimate, like real estate firms, entertainment firms, gamblers, what have you. But there's also a lot of crime involved, specifically organized crime. There's been a pretty decent sized move of triads, specifically Chinese triads, into the Cambodian market where they set up, brothels, various other trafficking operations, drug trafficking, what have you, and some slavery, apparently, from what I've read. Apparently, there has been an effort since the pandemic started, in particular, by local organized crime elements in Cambodia, in conjunction with organized crime in China, to issue jobs advertisements asking for people to come who have computer skills in particular to come work for them. And then when they get there, they take their passport and force them to work as slaves, basically, From what I read, it was generally they were forced to work on things like spam, basically online scams, because you kind of need some people with some computer acumen to do that. So, desperate college grads from China, who maybe couldn't find a job or just needed money, would often answer these ads going to Cambodia thinking they were just going to get like an IT type job, and then they would end up literally enslaved, working for a triad or other organized crime group, uh, trying to basically hack people or otherwise engage in online fraud of one kind or another. So that's also another kind of investment that China has been making into Cambodia. And if you're a corrupt autocratic leader in a developing country with weak rule of law and, well, really weak governance generally, as is the case in Cambodia, organized crime elements are actually very attractive because more conventional investments, things like retail or mining or what have you, stuff like that can generate a lot of money. But it generally has to be done in a way that's at least somewhat legal, and that somewhat inhibits the amount of money that they can kind of give to you, or more accurately, that you can demand from them. In contrast, organized crime elements are quite happy to engage in business dealings with governments. Basically, in exchange for avoiding problems with the police, they'll cut in politicians for a share of their profit, which can be pretty considerable. So autocratic leaders frequently have pretty strong links to organized crime elements in their country. So the suspicion here, on my part, is that the president of Cambodia probably has links like that, and that the fact is that he probably generates a pretty good chunk of his money from those links, to the point where if the United States government sanctioned Cambodia, it probably wouldn't matter at all, because organized crime groups don't really care about sanctions. So most likely the president will not be swayed by sanctions or most forms of US pressure at this point. In that sense, Cambodia is probably going to be a solidly China-aligned country for the foreseeable future. There's just not a lot of sticks that the United States has that can really be brought to bear there. Although, maybe I'm wrong. Again, need to read the article. Maybe I would learn something. But as far as I know, Cambodia is just too poor and sufficiently corrupt to be fairly immune to a lot of traditional tools of international pressure, so to speak. That's the Cambodia item that I have in mind. If there's something else going on, let me know. But that's the only thing I've heard of that I can think of off the top of my head.
Next one, Hungary.
Hungary. I don't think there's anything new going on in Hungary, is there?
I don't know.
I hadn't read
didn't
anything.
specify an item.
Yeah, it's just sort of the usual shenanigans on the part of the Orban government. Hungary's government is still very skeptical of Ukraine, relatively pro-Russia, still fighting with the European Union Court over problems with the electoral system and democracy generally. They may or may not have EU COVID funding cut off. There's a significant amount of funding that was distributed by the European Union to European Union member states to allow states to have a little more, to have some resources with which to deal with COVID-19 and the pandemic. And they continue to disperse those funds, but Hungary may be cut off from those funds if they don't make sufficient progress on certain items of concern for the European Union Court. So that remains unresolved. That's an ongoing issue. That's kind of all I can think of. I think there's been some protests against the government, but the opposition still hasn't really been able to find a winning formula that they can use to beat Orban at the polls. Even if Orban is very controversial, he's actually still fairly popular amongst a lot of people. Traditionalism, for one, kind of runs as the anti-woke candidate.
Mm-hmm.
He's one of those guys that tries to kind of make hay out of that. He also says that he's keeping the country out of war. He says that by prevaricating on the Ukraine issue and support for Ukraine, he's ensuring that Hungary does not incur punishment from Russia. So from the perspective of Hungarian nationalists, that's a plus. They don't want to have to sacrifice too much on the part of Ukraine. They would prefer to focus their resources on themselves. Yeah, that's all I can really think of. Yeah, I haven't heard too much about Hungary lately. I don't think they've been too proactive either. I think Orban is kind of keeping his head down, relatively speaking. Still likes to run his mouth all the time. He's always been a very vocal politician, but in terms of substantive policy or substantive action by the opposition, I don't think I've heard of anything happening recently.
He's the kind of guy who likes talking shit.
Oh yeah. Yeah, there was that comment he made a couple months ago. What was that? It was he was saying that he didn't think the people of Hungary wanted to be multiracial or that they didn't approve of racial intermixing. It's kind of a statement to that effect. So that, of course, got him into a lot of trouble. At least outside of Hungary, it did anyway. Yeah, he was making that statement in reference to immigration.
Hmm.
He's part of the sort of right wing of European politics that is very anti-immigration and is very skeptical of the benefits that it brings.
Yeah, we were just talking about that in stream today, actually, of how there was someone in the chat who was saying Finns aren't true Nords or something, and it was like, well, anyone from any country is going to have a lot of ancestors who had sex willy-nilly with a lot of different kinds of people, and no one is really purely this or purely that. It's all pretty mixed bag. So for him
Very
to be
true.
like they're not multiracial is very silly at best and very
Mhm.
racist at worst.
Yeah, America in particular is known for its intermixing.
Hmm.
We got a lot of people from everywhere here. I really couldn't tell you my own heritage going back maybe 100 or 200 years. It's kind of a motley combination of a lot of different peoples from different parts of Europe.
Hmm.
There's no one single source that I can kind of point to.
And then another thing too is the boundaries and borders of various countries historically are different than they are now. So you can point to a modern country border and say, my family was from there. Well, maybe kind of, but they migrated from somewhere and to somewhere else at various points. And then if you're American, they came over to the US at some point, unless you're Native American. We're
Yeah,
all
borders
mutts.
moving can be very complicated.
Hmm.
If you're looking at census data as far as the source of immigrants, you'll see that the United States got a weirdly large number of Austrians in the late 1800s and early 20th century.
Mm.
But those were not really ethnic Austrians. That is to say, not ethnic German Austrians. A lot of those were actually Slovaks, Hungarians, Czechs, basically the Slavic population. Those parts of Austria, Hungary were relatively poor in the late 19th century.
Hmm.
And so relatively more of them migrated out to the United States. So looking at the census data, they were classified as Austrian because they were from the Empire of Austria-Hungary, but their actual ethnicities were not, Austrian. There was a similar phenomena with Russians. There was a lot of Jews that left Russia in the late 19th century, partly because of violence, but also for opportunity. And when they came, they were generally classified as just Russians.
Hmm.
Uh, Same for Ukrainians and other ethnic groups that came from the Russian Empire at the time. It didn't matter if you were ethnic Russian or not. Just if you were from Russia, you were Russian. So the data can be a little confused on that. Can be a little confusing on that point. But yeah, there's a lot of intermixing amongst all those people as well within those borders.
Chet also asked if there is any update on Iran.
Now they're just killing more people at this point.
Mm.
Yeah, mostly on the streets, although the government did announce that they had executed the first protester.
Mm.
Everybody kind of suspected that they'd been arresting and, torturing them, but the government had not officially said that they had tried any of the protesters for what they call, quote unquote, enmity against God,
Oh.
which is punishable by death. And so there had been some speculation as to whether they would do that. That is to say, prosecute people, well, protesters specifically, for enmity against God and then punish them with death.
Mm.
So the government had kind of been prevaricating on whether or not that's what they wanted to do. They kind of tried at first to just let the protests run out, and then they sent in the Revolutionary Guard to use violence to suppress the protests, and that still wasn't working. And so now they've announced that they have, in fact, officially and publicly executed a protester for enmity against God. And from what I read, that's kind of a gamble, because on the one hand, that's scary, that probably will deter some people, but it's also really aggressive. And given how angry the protesters are, that could just embolden them and incite them even further, so maybe it deters people, but it could also incite them to further violence against the government. It kind of remains to be seen just exactly what effect it'll end up having on the public. But the government has now officially moved on to the phase where they're just executing people for having protested legally. Not like out on the street like they were before. There's been protesters who have been like shot or beaten to death or whatever. There's even video footage of some of that. But now they've gone through the court system, and the government has said, yes, legally, these people have committed a dire act and crime, and they will be punished with death. Now, it could be that the guy that they killed, I don't remember his name, but it's well known amongst Iranians at this point. But it could be that they were just trying to make an example out of him specifically, and that they might not actually follow up with more executions, depending on how people respond. Mm-hmm. So, it could be that if, it also depends on who's in power. It could be that if the hardliners are in control, they'll respond with more violence if the protests continue. So they'll probably just continue executing people. But if there's more of a divide within the power elite within Iran, it could be that if people escalate further after the execution, then the more moderate wing of the government will win out and will argue successfully in favor of refraining from further executions of imprisoned protesters. A little difficult to judge. It's an opaque political system, so we don't really fully know the balance of power between people in the governing camp. I would point out that there's not really any moderates in the government at this point. They kind of edged out the moderates. And even the moderates, as they were known, over the course of the 1980s, 90s, and aughts, even they were relatively pro-government. The government never really allowed anybody who was explicitly anti-government to run for office. So that was a relatively sort of centrist opposition that comprised the moderate camp. But then the nationalists just pushed them out. The Ayatollah, in conjunction with the Revolutionary Guard Corps, became ever more strict with who was allowed to run for office. And at this point, it's basically only nationalists that are pro-government that can run. And the result then is that when I talk about moderate forces versus radical forces within the government, it's really moderates versus radicals within the radical government, right? There's not really anybody who's not nationalistically conservative in the government at this point. But there is some disagreement about how to deal with the protests. There's always policy differences by this, that, or the other faction within any given government. So some people within the government, while they hate the protests and want to crack down, argue against doing so because they think it would cause more problems than it would solve. But then there's always the hardliners that just want to kill everything that they don't like, and so their solution is, of course, more violence. So from what I've read, there is some dispute within the government. It's not entirely clear just what the balance of power is again, but the protesters are at least forcing some of those disputes out into the open. There have been some statements by politicians in Iran to the effect that they don't agree with the government's stance and policy on this issue. It's just not clear if that's going to matter yet. So that's just something we kind of have to watch for. If the government does start offering concessions and kind of pull back from violence, that would suggest that there's more of a divide than we knew about before. But if they just keep escalating the violence, that means that there's probably not really all that much divide within the government, or at least not enough to prevent the government from deepening the crackdown.
So there aren't really any advocates in the government for the people who are protesting and trying to lobby for what they're about?
No, not really. Not at this point.
What's the scale of the protests, do you know?
They started out pretty regional in the northwest of the country, specifically in Kurdish territories, and I think a disproportionate share of the protests are still there. But the protests have spread to the rest of the country at this point, so they are nationwide protests. You can see protests in virtually every region of the country, every city. Again, you see relatively larger and more protests in the Northwest, but you do see them in the rest of the country as well. And they are ongoing. The protesters are sticking it out. It's only going to get harder from here, but more power to them. Hopefully, they can kind of get the government they want rather than the one imposed by people who pretense to having some kind of special dispensation from God to govern over them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're in trouble when your government's legitimacy is derived from the word of God. It's never good things that they do with that. Do what I tell you because God told me that I can tell you what to do. That never ends well for anybody.
Yeah, I don't think there are that many countries where that's still how the laws are run. It seems like a very foreign concept to me
Yeah.
because America is very multi-religious.
Oh,
So you would
yeah.
say which God? Probably the Christian God if it was the US, but yeah, that's not really something that Christian countries do anymore. Maybe if you go back to the Spanish Inquisition or the
Well,
medieval
I mean,
period.
also think in terms of kings, because the divine right of kings was specifically reasoned in terms of godly support. Kings were kings because God had anointed them as such.
Right.
And in that sense, their legitimacy and rule was derived from the holy. So even in Europe, even if we didn't have a theocracy per se, like what Iran has now, we still derived quite a bit of authority, supposedly. Well, the kings did anyway, from God. So it's not a foreign concept per se to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
We definitely have a lot of history with that. But it didn't work out well for Europe. Kings can get a little too ambitious for their own good. And they tend to cause problems. It's better to have some checks and balances in there.
I think it also
Filibusters may be stupid, but they keep governments out of trouble.
no. It kind of reminds me a little bit of what you're saying about the Japanese emperor and how they get experts underneath them to handle stuff, and then at a point the monarch can basically be pretty lazy and they don't really
Hmm.
need to do too much themselves, which means that you get a dysfunctional monarch who's not able to defend or expand or manage the country's borders. And that's when there's big shifts in power and that kind of thing.
Well, it doesn't even require that kind of instability. It could just be that the bureaucrats just edge him out.
Mm-hmm.
They can actually manage the country just fine without him. And they
Mm-hmm.
don't even need to cite his disinterest as a sort of reason. They can just say, hey, this is a good thing for you because it's less work. You can just sit back and relax and let us take care of everything for you.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of kings are more interested in their harems than they are in their government. So that
Mm-hmm.
was a deal a lot of the less prestigious kings in history were willing to make.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was only later when the king was sufficiently detached from power and the bureaucrats felt sufficiently confident in their control of the state apparatus that the bureaucrats might get even more ambitious and just say outright, hey, we're going to remove you from power and declare a new emperor, which is going to be one of us instead
Mm-hmm.
of you. Yeah, that wasn't too uncommon in places like Egypt or the Ottoman Empire, because they actually had a lot of slaves that were they were a very different kind of slave than the slaves Americans think of. Slavery in the United States was very much chattel slavery and was very focused on labor intensive activity, like plantation work or, something like refining of sugar and rice and whatnot. But in the Ottoman Empire and Egypt and other parts of the Middle East, slaves were often trained to be very educated so that they could fulfill roles in a government. Specifically, a sultan's slaves could be trained to become like a tax collector or a general in the army or something like that. The Ottomans were famous for their janissaries, who had been the Christian children taken from their parents and then taken as slaves when they were very young, and then taught to be Muslims. They were converted to Islam, and then they were brought up to be soldiers that populated the Ottoman army and the officer corps. So slaves could be very well educated, and they could be so educated and so powerful within a given, bureaucracy that some of them actually just declared themselves emperor and started whole new dynasties. If you read the history of Egypt, there's one dynasty called the Mamluk dynasty, and Mamluk is actually translates as slave. It basically means slave dynasty because the guy that founded it had actually been a slave serving in the bureaucracy who just decided, I already basically control the kingdom anyway, let's just make it official. And then he just launched a coup throughout the old emperor and then declared himself the new master. They actually also had a Mamluk dynasty in the Delhi Sultanate, I think. It was one of the sultanates in northern India in sort of the medieval period of India's history. And it was the same deal. It was just a slave that, rose up and seized control from the previous emperor. Actually, the Mamluk dynasty in northern India had a particularly cool story because there was one guy whose mother had been a Hindu princess. And, there was this one Muslim sultan in the Delhi Sultanate. I forget which dynasty specifically it was, but he forced this princess to marry him, to leave her family and be his bride. And she didn't want to, because I think she was actually already married at the time. But the Sultan just forced her to. She had no choice. And she was very unhappy. And so she eventually bore him a son. And, the son was raised as a Muslim and whatnot, but the mother also raised him in the knowledge that she had been forced into that relationship and that his father was a shithead, basically. Mm. And he actually grew up. He was not the heir per se. He was basically just a slave. But when he grew up, he actually went out of his way to just totally fuck up his father's kingdom and just be a total asshole to him. He just sabotaged everything, eventually seized control, launched a bunch of wars. Like, this was very much the epitome of medieval angsty teenager getting revenge on his parents. Mm. In violent fashion. It was one of the more fascinating stories I'd read from the period.
That's cool. Pronunciation correction. Epitome.
Epitome, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, payback stories are always fun. It's a lot more crushing and sad when they don't get payback. They're just consistently oppressed.
We doing okay on time?
Yeah, got a bit longer.
Okay.
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Well, I guess going back to the price cap for Russian oil, I don't think it's expected that that's going to have a big impact, for the reasons I kind of outlined. But it could have a dramatic impact on oil prices in the global market. There have been some speculation that the policy might work a little too well, and it could upset the oil market a bit. But I don't think that has happened, because the policy's been in place for a week now or so, and there hasn't been any kind of implosion. So for the moment, it seems that fears that it would spiral out of control were not entirely justified. Let's see. There's some other stuff going on, but it's not too critical. Indonesia is going to ban sex outside of marriage. That's a law they just recently passed. Good luck enforcing that.
Let me see your marriage papers. Oh my gosh, I left them at home.
Yeah, when governments pass stuff like that, it almost always means that they're just going to basically de facto deputize people to just go after people they hate. Mm. And I think the way they wrote the law is that only if you're underage, then it's only parents who can kind of get you convicted under this law. They can complain, and the government will punish you. If you're an adult, then I think it has to be a spouse specifically, so it can't be anybody else. But at the same time, somebody could use blackmail or whatever, or otherwise kind of use the law to try to punish somebody they don't like. So I don't doubt that they will try to make that will happen. That law is going to get abused. Laws like that are just always abused, invariably. Even if they tried to write it to somewhat limit the scope, I don't think it's going to work. Especially with teenagers. Teenagers are just so horny that you just can't stop them, really. Doesn't matter if you have the whole government's monopoly on violence at hand. There's just no real deterrence to that. There's no public policy solution to stupid horny.
You cannot stop the pervs.
I'm afraid not. Let's see. In Israel, there was some news about what the far right government is going to look like. So there has been negotiations about who's going to get what cabinet. So it looks like one of the far right parties is going to get the what is it? Ministry of the Interior, I think it was. National Security Minister. That's what it was. So part of the portfolio of that job involves security in the occupied territories. So you can probably guess what the reaction is to the prospect of having a far right, borderline racist candidate be put in charge of security in Palestine. It has not been great. And there's a lot of fear that things are going to get a lot worse once he's actually at work, so to speak, in that office. So keep an eye on that. I'm sure we'll be hearing about it soon. This was a fun one. So in India, there was, 200 kilograms, which is about 440 pounds of cannabis that had been seized by dealers and was being stored in police stations. And as it happens, it disappeared. And when inquiries were made, the local police said that it was eaten by rats.
Oh my goodness. So the rats came in. It was really weird. We were just so shocked that they would come in and try to take all of our weed and smoke it in front of us. You would never believe it.
Yeah, some experts online were commenting on it, and they were saying they were pretty skeptical about the rat story. They don't think the rats would have managed to survive quite that much weed.
Man, these are some pretty lit rats. Rat jam. That's funny.
So I thought that might be a cute story to end on.
Nice. Well, if you have any weed that is confiscated by police and the police certainly didn't smoke it themselves, you might want to hire a cat to keep in the office. And maybe later on we'll find a different story about a cat that smoked all the weed. This is reminding me of the locusts and ducks battles that we tried. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Blaming different animals causing different problems.
Say la vie.
Well, awesome having you on as always. Thank you, chat, for your interest and your engagement in this segment. We do this every Sunday, usually at around 6 p.m. Pacific time, 8 p.m. Central time. And if you have any comments, questions, corrections, or scathing reviews for the YouTube comments, feel free. We want to try to fix stuff if we messed it up. No one's perfectly unbiased, and we have our perspective being from the U.S. So if you have a local story you want to share or something you want to ask about for the next Agent Smith, let us know. And thanks, Agent Smith, for help bringing some fresh content as we're fighting through this amazing subathon. I've been live nonstop, so for someone else to take the wheel and get to talk for a bit gives me a nice period to listen and just get to build stuff in StarCraft. So thank you for that as well.
Happy to oblige. And, thank you, as always, for the opportunity. It's always a privilege.
Okay. You're also getting a bonus this week because of how nice the community has been.
Oh.
So Merry Christmas.
Nice. Well, thank you, everyone. Much appreciated.
Yep.
Quick question. Are you going to be on next week, or are you doing Christmas stuff?
I'm probably not traveling this year for Christmas. I just visited family in November. So we're probably going to have another family get together in like the summer, most likely. So I should be around next weekend. Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough. I will be ready.
Cool. And we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. See you next time.
GG. Your bonus was eaten by rats. Nice.